the room, we'll go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, I'm admitting all and closing waiting room.
Great, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Great to have you here. We've got folks from all around the world, and we're just so pleased you've been able to join us for today's workshop and tomorrow's continuation. Really pleased to have you here. As you make your way into the workshop room, I'm just going to encourage you to make sure your microphone is off. You can leave your video on, but you may find bandwidth helps if you turn it off for the moment. And as you set up your screen today, I invite you to click on the little button that says View. It's often at the top right side of your screen. There you can choose the side-by-side gallery view or side-by-side speaker view. And if you choose the side-by-side, you'll be able to shift around the presentation mode, as well as see some of the colleagues that you are gathered here with today. I also just want to point out that we've got Kelsey Walsh. Her email and her phone number are here if you need technical assistance, and you can also send Kelsey a direct message using chat and just find Kelsey Walsh. If you're having any technical difficulties today, please don't hesitate to reach out to Kelsey. She's here to support you. So I think we have most folks here to get started. So perhaps with that in mind, I will turn things directly over to Biana to formally welcome you and begin our conversation today. So over to you, Biana.
Thanks, Barb. So welcome to the IEA Bioenergy Workshop with collaboration with GBEP, where we will examine the knowledge, exchange experience, and the view on how can biomass supply for bioenergy deliver multiple benefits and contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. So we all know, and you have read it from the poster, that bioenergy is currently the largest source of renewable energy, and it is predicted to increase significantly as countries continue to look for low carbon fuel alternatives. Increasing demand for bioenergy will necessitate a significant decrease in the amount of biomass sustainably procured, which is expected to come from a variety of sources. And now we are trying to seek the options, how to do more than just SDG 7, how to make a holistic approach to contribute with all 17 Sustainable Development Goals as described in the UN's Agenda 2030, Agenda for Sustainable Development. So this work will examine how biomass supply for bioenergy can contribute to SDGs beyond renewable energy supply and provide multiple co-benefits. The workshop will focus on the relationships between the SDGs and different biomass supply chains in the regions, because biomass and SDGs are very much context related, and sharing the best practice case studies from around the world could help recognize this favorable context. Here on the screen, you have the objectives of this workshop that you are trying to reach. And what we have 2 days, because we wanted to facilitate remote attendance to the online workshop. And I'm happy to report that we have 77 registered experts on bioenergy. The most people are registered from Europe. There are 29 from Sweden, Denmark, Slovakia, Holland, Croatia, Italy, Finland, and Denmark. 22 from North America, 50-50 between the US and Canada. We have 9 from Central and South America, Argentina, Brazil, Costa Rica, Mexico, and Guatemala. 7 of those are global from different umbrella organizations such as UN, FAO, GBEP, OECD, Biofuture Platform. And then we have 4 from Africa, Kenya, South Africa, and Sierra Leone, 3 Asia, Sri Lanka, Philippines, and Vietnam, and 1 is Australia and Oceania. And 1 is from Australia and Oceania, not because they don't have interest in bioenergy, it is because it is very early in the morning or in the night, late at night at that time. So by the end of this workshop, those from Africa and Europe will still have time to pick up the kids up from the schools, and participants from Asia will have late dinner, while we will finish by lunch in Americas. So now I will not spend more time. I wish you a successful day. So today we will have 2 days. First day, they will both start in the same day. Today we will focus on SDGs and biomass supply chains, and tomorrow we're going to go for regional overviews. And I will hand you over to Barb.
Thank you very much, Biana. Really good to have your introduction and your welcoming remarks. To help situate today's workshop, I would like to welcome Huva to the virtual stage, just to give us a little update on the Intertask project. So Huva, maybe I'll turn things to you, please.
Thank you. What I would like to do, first of all, thanks Biljana and Spock, to thank all the contributors, participants today. An Intertask project from the IEA Bioenergy TCP called Role of Bioenergy in a Well Below 2 Centigrade SDG World. That's the context where the resources for this workshop comes from. And it's meant to be a workshop. And the next slide may show you that. Our goals, you may have heard or read already what the goals of this workshop today and tomorrow are. In general, the project would like to identify and disseminate strategies for bioenergy which consider the SDGs, basically, without negative trade-offs, if possible, and identify synergies where the development of bioenergy and the SDGs are positively linked. And you may be aware of the recent IEA Zero Emission 2050 scenario, which looks into the future and tries to identify the role not only of bioenergy, but also of bioenergy, also hydrogen and other renewables and energy efficiency. And part of that is actually to look into implementation of those strategies which are in sync with the SDGs. Clearly, it's not an easy thing. We know that. It's basically calling for a transformation of the whole energy system and also of the material, transport system, food systems, and so forth, a major task. But it could be well that biomass and bioenergy in particular could contribute to that transformation. The next slide, please. If we look into the activities we have in this project, there are basically 4. Activity 1 and 2 are related mainly to the climate change issue, to the well below 2 centigrade issue. We already have a report out, that's on the next slide, which will be shown in a minute. And we also consider the issue of forests and other land uses in agriculture in that context. So it's not just bioenergy as such, substituting for fossil fuels. It's also the land-related activities which are part of our game. And you see in the dashed ellipse, in the green dashed ellipse, the activities B1 and B2, which actually try to identify those bioenergy feedstocks, production systems, and conversion systems, which have these multiple benefits in terms of the SDG metrics. And once we have identified them, we won't stick there, but we would like to actually talk about implementation strategies for those solutions. So that is an issue of governance, and we will have hopefully some time during today and tomorrow to not only talk about the cases, but also the circumstances and the prospects. And you may have seen from the agenda that in the final panel, the issue of governance will be raised again. So without further delay, the next slide gives you the contact to Joran, who is a bit hindered today, so I took over, and myself. If you have any questions regarding this project, please feel free to contact us. And you see in the lower part of the slide the link to the A1 report from last year, which I really, really recommend you to take a look at. It's a very comprehensive thing, and it's also a collaborative effort. It was based on an excellent workshop we had with many, many participants from around the planet. And hopefully this workshop will follow this logic to be collaborative, that you make your inputs, your statements, also your critique if you have that, and that we can contribute together to the SDGs. And with that, I hand back to the moderator.
Thank you so much, Uwe. And the link that you just shared in your slide, Kelsey has put into chat. So if you're looking to track that down, I think you'll be able to find it there as well. All of these presentations will be available after the workshop through the task group's website. So you can be sure to be able to tap into these resources afterwards. We're just about to formally get started with the content, but I just wanted to help orient you for a moment on today's tips for working with Zoom. So by this point, most of us are pretty comfortable, but just to remind folks of a few things. One thing that's not on the slide, I do encourage you to update your Zoom name to include your first name and last name, as well as your organization. And that just helps us to get a sense of who is here, especially when you're in your breakout groups. So to do that, you can just simply right-click on your video or your name. There's a little blue box with the 3 dots. You can right-click and choose rename and update your content there. You also can do that by clicking on the participants button, which is usually at the bottom of your screen. There's a participants panel. And if you find your name, you can simply select more and update rename. Today we'll just be largely using chat as our way of interacting with one another. We've already started to use chat, and I invite you to participate that way with your questions that you might have. Occasionally we may turn to hands up, but because we're such a large group, we'll probably steer most of our conversation through to chat. I also invite you to stay on mute through the plenary sessions, unless of course you are speaking. That will just help to minimize the background noise. If you have to leave the meeting and come back in, I encourage you to keep your video off as you re-enter. That way you don't accidentally end up on the front screen of a panel should we be in the middle of the panel. For those of you who may be joining by phone, you can tap *6 to mute and unmute yourself, or *9 to raise your hands. I've spoken about renaming yourself. A couple of other key points towards the bottom of this list. You may find it easiest to orient your slide by choosing the side-by-side view, which there's a little button called View, and you can click that and choose the side-by-side speaker or side-by-side gallery if you want to see all the other folks in the room. Important message here, do not log off during the breaks that we have scheduled. During those breaks, we'll be moving you into breakout groups behind the scenes, and we need you to stay connected. So please do not hit the red leave button. That makes it really hard for us to get you back into a group. So just if you need to step away from your computer, that's fine, but I encourage you to not leave, especially during breaks. And we are recording today's session, both plenary and breakout groups. The plenary recordings will be available at a later date, and the breakout group recordings will be used to help with preparing the report. So with that, I just would like to take a moment to let you know who all is here. So normally in a workshop room, we would see everyone around the tables and do a brief introduction, but we don't have the opportunity to do that today. So on the next slide, you'll see all of the individual organizations that have registered for today's and tomorrow's workshops. And so there's quite a diverse group, as Biana referenced earlier, from all around the world. And we welcome each one of you here. If you don't see your organization on there, please make sure you include it in chat so that we don't lose track of you. And to help us with getting a picture of where everyone is, I invite you now to interact with us a little bit. So here we have a map of the world, and I'd love to know, where are you joining us from today? So we can play around with this map by putting a star or a check mark on that location where you are joining us from today. So to do that, you'll see the little tip in the bottom left of the screen. If you find the View Options box and click on that, you'll see an option that says Annotate. If you click Annotate, you can pick a stamp, a star, a heart, whatever you'd like, and click on the map where you are joining us from today. And that way we'll have a sense of where everyone's from. So we've got people coming in from North America and Europe. If you want to change the color so we can see it a little bit easier than the gold color, you can choose format and pick your color. It might show up a little bit better. Oh, and we have someone who's drawn an arrow to South Africa. Thank you, welcome. Lots of people from the eastern part of North America. I'm checking in close, lots of people from Europe, welcome. And if you're having trouble locating the view options, annotate and stamp, feel free to say hello in chat if that is easier for you to participate that way. Great, we've got someone here from Brazil, lovely. And you can see people's names pop up as they interact. So good to have you here. And someone, is that someone from New Zealand? I'm seeing typing down there, and someone from Asia, perhaps Southern China. Someone from Argentina, welcome. And someone from Russia. Is that you, Bruno, up in Russia? Are you checking?
Yeah, I was trying to close the chat box, so it's my mistake, sorry.
Okay, I'm like, well, I didn't know someone was from Northern Russia joining us, but welcome. Lovely. So we'll take another moment and just to play around with the locations, and then we'll have one more moment to interact with each other, and then we'll get started on our formal agenda. I can see you playing, so that's good. And someone from Australia. I was waiting for the person from Australia. I know it's late for you, so welcome. Thank you for bravely putting your star up. Great. So with this, Chris, maybe just grab a quick screenshot of where we've got folks joining us from. And we'll do one more small sort of just getting our minds together in the space that we're going to have our conversation. So I invite you, if you're able, to just find another browser on your computer or your phone and type in the www.menti.com. And with this website, it's a way for us to interact and sort of brainstorm in just a moment's activity. You can type in the code that's showing on your screen. We'll also put it into chat, the 3662-1825. So if you go to www.menti.com, type in the code, and then I'll invite you to think about, why is this conversation that we're having today and tomorrow important for you to join today? What is it that draws you to this? Why do you care so much about this particular conversation? And in a word or two, jot down your answer, and then we'll share where everyone is at, just so that we bring our minds together as we start to move through the conversation today. So find your link to Menti, type in the 7 digits or 8-digit number that's showing on your screen or in chat, and we'll start to see the ideas come forward now. Chris, do you want to see if we're getting some ideas coming in? Maybe you can make it a little bit bigger. Perfect. Great. So you can see the ideas building together in front of your eyes. Sustainability, future generations, holistic perspectives, global policy, theoretical to practical, gaining different perspectives, holistic perspective, integrative biosolutions. Lots around sustainability and sustainable development, thinking towards the future, valorization, climate change, learning and evidence, co-creating solutions, You can see the bigger the letter, the more people have rallied around and shared that same content. So sustainability is certainly emerging as what is a driving force about why this conversation is important to you. And with that, thank you for your input. Thank you for coming together today. Really looking forward to our conversations. I would like to now invite us to transition over to our first set of speakers. So ahead of us, I will have Bruno introduce the presenters. Maybe we can just go to the next slide, Chris. As we go through, you see we have 6 speakers, and Bruno will kindly introduce them. We've asked each presenter to speak for about 8 minutes. They've got lots of great content. As questions emerge for you, feel free to put them into chat. We will have a few minutes scheduled at the end of this first agenda component to bring forward 1 or 2 questions, but we won't likely get to all of them. So we've invited each presenter to go and have a look at chat and try to respond to your questions. And for questions that we don't get to, we are keeping track of them, and they may certainly be used to inform upcoming task group workshops. And for the presenters that are here, I will just jump in around the 8-minute mark just to give you a verbal cue where you're at with time so that we can try and make sure we get through all of you. So with that, Bruno, I'm going to turn things straight over to you to welcome your panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Barb. Today, we're very lucky to have speakers from around the world to share with us some of the latest developments on SDGs and biomass supply chains. So from left to right, Mr. Henry Neufeld is head of impact assessment and adaptation at the UNEP DTU partnership, where he leads the UNEP DTU partnership's work on transparency in adaptation under the UNFCCC. He has over 20 years of experience in international research for development and policy advice on climate change mitigation and adaptation. Mr. Jim Philp is a policy analyst at the Science, Technology and Innovation Directorate of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD. He joined the OECD in 2011 with responsibilities in biotechnology, biomass sustainability, and synthetic biology. Ms. Constance Miller is the lead technical advisor to the Global Bioenergy Partnership, or GBEP, at FAO, where she worked since 2016, coordinating the technical groups of the GBEP Secretariat and contributing to various GBEP and FAO projects. Mr. Andrea Rossi is a member of the Biofuture Platform facilitation team at the IEA. Before, he was FAO's lead technical officer for several sustainability energy programs and projects in multiple countries in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. Ms. Luisa Marelli is head of the Bioeconomy unit at the European Commission's Joint Research Center, scientific officer at JRC since 2003. She works on sustainability issues on biofuels, bioenergy, and bioeconomy, as well as SDG implementation. And last but not least, Ms. Jean Blair is research affiliate in the Kenyan Forest Service and at Calumet Energy at Natural Resources Canada. And our recent research and work as a consultant focused on community-based forest bioeconomy and sustainable biomass supply chains. So with that, I'll pass it over to Henry for the first presentation.
Thank you, Bruno. I hope everybody can hear me.
Yes, we can. All good.
Great. Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, and thanks for this invitation. It's really great to be here today. I was invited by Jan Berndes to speak here today because we're together heading a box on the bioeconomy within the IPCC 6th assessment report, to which we are both lead or coordinating lead authors. So I'll talk about nature-based solutions, biomass, and SDGs. I won't talk about biomass supply. And all 3 of these topics are actually worth discussing on their own. So I'm not going to be able to do justice to everything within the time that I've been given. That said, can you please move on? How does this work? Do I tell you when to?
Yeah, just give a verbal, Henry, we'll move for you.
Okay, so let's start with what are nature-based solutions. And according to the IUCN, they are actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural and modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So we'll talk about protection, management, and restoration of natural and modified ecosystems a lot today. That's important. It's a core sort of concept. And we'll also have to talk a lot about human and biodiversity in the same context. So we can't have nature-based solutions without biodiversity benefits or without human well-being. That said, we also know that nature-based solutions are often low-cost options, at least over their lifetimes. If you think about them, they provide a lot of benefits over the course of their existence, but it takes time to build up these benefits. And that's one of the reasons why it's difficult to get funding for them. They provide a lot of co-benefits, environmental, social, economic benefits to a wide range of stakeholders. And very importantly, they are often affected by climate change. So we have to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions to the degree possible to avoid affecting nature-based solutions so that they no longer function in the way they are supposed to. Next slide, please. To look at this from a broader perspective, right now we have this perfect storm. It's a vicious cycle where climate change, land degradation, and biodiversity loss all together work towards reducing human well-being. And all of these three elements affect each other. Climate change affects land degradation, and land degradation through greenhouse gas emissions enhances climate change. Climate change affects biodiversity loss, and biodiversity loss again has effects on climate change, and vice versa. Land degradation and biodiversity loss are also interconnected. And that means we cannot solve any of these problems without solving the other problems. So we can't just talk about climate change or biodiversity or land degradation. We have to talk about these things together. And nature-based solutions address these different elements in a coherent way and thereby address the Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide, please. And to put that into a few numbers, coming from a very recent UNEP report, you know, farmlands and crop and pastures, you know, they cover nearly 40% of land surface, and 20% of that is already degraded in one way or the other in the process of degradation. 35% of freshwater of wetlands are degraded since the 1970s, and 66% of oceans and coastal zones are negatively affected through human action. So these are the downsides of our activities that produce our well-being. You know, this is development ultimately, and we have to change the way we manage land and in our economies in order to get away from this destructive cycle. Working with nature, on the other hand, produces a lot of benefits, such as, you know, it can contribute to roughly 30%, according to this, of mitigation. And, you know, it has huge biodiversity benefits that, you know, as I explained, have effects on climate change and on land. Next slide. Since when I was born roughly 50 years ago, you know, 2/3 of the land were unmanaged. Today, it's about 1/3 that's left, that's unmanaged. So we've lost a lot of the nature that used to be there, we took for granted. And now we're facing more problems as populations grow and affluence rises in different countries. So we're consuming more, and therefore we need to manage our ecosystems better to address with less resources, what is a growing challenge. One way through which nature can contribute to that is mitigation, of course. And on the right slide of this panel, you can see that nature-based solutions are estimated to contribute or potentially contribute up to 10 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year, half of which is through avoided emissions, the other half is through enhancing the sinks. And if you look at, again here, protection, management, and restoration of lands, you can see that protecting lands, avoiding their destruction, is an important contribution to keeping climate change in a manageable scope. Then working with lands by both, again, avoiding emissions through improved management or enhancing the sinks is equally important. And then finally, restoration of degraded lands will add another 2 gigatons of CO2 equivalents per year. Next slide. When we did the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report, which I led last year, produced this Sankey diagram. It's based on nearly 1,000 projects looking at adaptation and nature-based solutions, addressing all sorts of climate risks, which you can see: coastal precipitation, drought, temperature rise, in multiple ways. And a lot of nature-based solutions on the right side of this panel, you see contributing to that. And if you look at the approaches, the practices that do that, you can see that a lot of them also have mitigation co-benefits. That said, we need to increase the investment because when you look at the numbers, and I did that, there's still the quantity, the amount of funding that goes into nature-based solutions is still a drop in the bucket. Also, it's difficult to mobilize additional funding for nature-based solutions, adaptation or mitigation, doesn't matter, because despite the high benefit to cost ratios, it takes a lot of time to develop the benefits. There are high opportunity costs, there are high transaction costs, there's large numbers of stakeholders involved. So these are all elements that make it difficult for private sector investment to go into this area. And I want to raise that because it requires public-private partnerships to make nature-based solutions work. And we need to find more innovative approaches to finance and to develop, to increase implementation of nature-based solution options. Next slide.
So Henry, with about 1 minute left, just as a heads up.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Okay, so in the same process, I developed, I tagged all the co-benefits, environmental, social, economic, policy related, and other risk management options that were articulated in these projects. And you can see that they go everywhere, all scales. I don't want to go into the numbers here. Next slide. Next slide. What I do want to show is that when we look at biomass, energy, and the bioeconomy in the context agri-food goals, there are often a lot of trade-offs that we have to look at. And without having the time to go into the details here, you can see that energy-related biomass production often has a lot of trade-offs. And I'm just saying that we need to be very careful when we develop our systems not to enhance the trade-offs or expand trade-offs against the benefits of, for instance, protecting nature. So we have to look at these systems in a more integrated way. Next slide. This is the final slide. I'm going to skip the other ones. A few pitfalls when looking at nature-based solutions. We need to focus on decarbonizing our energy systems. Offsetting greenhouse gas emissions with nature-based solutions does not work. It just doesn't work. It's hot air, really. There is currently an overemphasis on tree planting, rather than the wider range of nature-based solutions. And I think it's worth looking into the broader perspective here. There are potential adverse effects on local communities that we need to be mindful of when developing approaches. And we have to make sure that when we develop nature-based solutions, we do not do that at the expense of biodiversity. On the right side, you can see that there is a reduction of water availability in red as a trade-off. This is based on nearly 200 peer-reviewed papers that have been analyzed by Chausson et al. In this paper recently. And you can see that the trade-offs, you can't see that, but the article makes it clear that most of this is based on tree planting, afforestation, reforestation with exotic or non-adapted species. So that's an area to be careful of. Next slide and final slide. Thank you very much. Oh no, I need to talk about that one. Sorry, go back please. About scaling up. There are a lot of initiatives going on right now. 4 pour 1000, for instance, in agriculture, the Bond Challenge reaching 350 million hectares. The Great Green Wall in Africa, 100 million hectares. Regreening Africa, 500 million hectares. A lot of this is double counting, but the scale is going up. And I just wanted you to look at the left side where you can see in Niger, 1975, barely any trees. 2004, a lot of trees in the same area. And that has been mainly due to changes in the governance of the land, next to other factors, but governance in the land has been crucial in achieving that goal. And for you to have a look to see what we talk about when what we see actually when we talk about the green wall of Africa, it's the bottom slide. It's a mixture of open and more densely vegetated areas, agroforestry, parkland, savanna, managed actively through the smallholders. It's not a wall. It's very actively managed by people. And that is the core to the success. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Henry. And for those who are wanting to give you a round of applause for pushing through all that great content, there's a reactions button. We can do a clap if you'd like. Thank you, Henry. Really appreciate it. Jim, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for the invitation, and thanks everyone for being here. Time is a little short, so I'll get straight into this. So next slide, please. Okay, I'm starting this presentation by talking about a council recommendation of ours. And for those that don't know, as in the OECD, the council recommendation is our highest form of soft law instrument. And we published a council recommendation in 2012 on the sustainability of bio-based products. And for us, a lot of this was about governance based on sustainability. So every few years, usually every 5 years, we're asked to monitor the relevance of the council recommendation and also its implementation. So we did that in 2020 and 21, and we've just published the results. We got surprisingly answers from 26 countries. And to simplify this slide here, what we need here is, if we think this is still relevant, we need as much green in this slide as possible. So that constitutes answers which say that the council recommendation is still relevant and needs no changes. If it's orange or sorry, yellow or amber, it's relevant but still needs changes. And if it's red, it means it's obsolete. So hardly anybody thought the instrument was obsolete. Most people thought it was relevant without changes. So next slide, please, and that talks about implementation. Now, here we see a slightly different pattern. So we asked about these 10 individual recommendations which constitute the overall recommendation. So across the top, you see R1 to R10 are these individual 10 recommendations. And the countries said to us, the ones which are ringed in green, what we have here is countries that said all 10 of the recommendations had been implemented, and in red, countries that said none of those recommendations had been implemented. So some of this was a bit of a surprise to us. I think for me, the most surprising was South Africa, because in 2013, they produced a very sophisticated, splendid bioeconomy strategy. But here they're telling us, the government's telling us that, that nothing had been implemented. And we do this so that other countries can see where they are in relation to their neighbors or to their competitors. And finally, I have on the top right, I have a circle around recommendation number 9. And that's important to us because recommendation number 9 was about the communication and cooperation with non-member countries. And what you see here is that recommendation 9 was the least implemented. So there's a nice example of a message we can send to the OECD countries is this is extremely important because this is, after all, is about international trade. And here we're hearing that we're not communicating with the non-member countries, and some of them are extremely important to the bioeconomy, you know, Brazil, India, etc. So next slide, please. So when I look at that, we on the left here, we have the report on that implementation, which is just published this year, earlier this year in March, and it's been updated on the right. The council has been updated slightly, but very, very little at all. And that's back out there when we'll be reviewed in another few years' time. Next slide, please. So the next part of the talk for us, most of my work has been about biotechnologies. And I have to say, over the 10 years or so I've been in the OECD, I've been disappointed at the response of the bioeconomy community when it comes to biotechnologies. In fact, in many countries, it seems to me that biotechnologies as solutions, as Henry was talking about, when these problems come to us, they have to be acted on in coordination. You can't act on them in isolation. And we've argued a long time that biotechnologies have answers to what we are calling this grand challenges ecosystem. So some of you will be unfamiliar with these terms. We looked at a lot of work in the biorefineries, and we came to the conclusion that the part in the middle here, which you see DBTL, these are the biofoundries, and we think these are a missing link in bio-based production. The biofoundries bring reproducibility to bio-based production, because in most of our industries, the strains which are used in production are not really well characterized or standardized. And by standardization, you can take, for example, a USB port is a good example of engineering standardization. That hasn't happened in most of biotechnologies. So I've just summed up in a slide here where we think the biotechnologies can fit in with the Sustainable Development Goals. The BRCs are biological resource centers, and we call those the curators of the known biology. And the biofoundries in the middle, the design, build, test, learn cycle, we call those the maker or the producers of the new biology. So this is fresh new biology which can be created now through gene synthesis. So again, the final message here is there are a lot of sectors involved where biotechnologies can contribute, and the contributions can come to many of the SDGs, but that's a message which is largely overlooked just now. Next slide, please, which I think is my final slide. Yes, in 2009, we had a landmark publication where we asked countries to come to us with innovative policy frameworks. And that didn't happen. So last year, a Norwegian colleague and myself published this framework here, which is familiar to innovation policymakers, which goes from basically ideas to market. But in this case, we started with feedstocks, going through technology, industrialization to market. And we tried to marry together value chains, which are very essential to this, compared to just looking at biorefineries, and measure that up with generic policies. And the idea here is that this makes this more acceptable to governments. There is a huge amount of shift here to a new paradigm, and it scares governments. But what we're saying is many of the specific policies of bioeconomy can be married to generic policies and make that a sweeter pill to swallow. And at that, I think I'll stop, and thank you very much for your attention.
Jim, thank you so much. Great overview. Really appreciate your input. Folks, if you do have questions, feel free to put them in chat. I'm sure Jim and Henry will be happy to answer them. Much appreciation, Jim. Thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, I'll turn things to Constance. Constance, over to you.
Hi, thanks a lot, Bob. Hi, good afternoon, good morning, everybody. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit, giving a very brief overview because I don't have much time of the Global Bioenergy Partnership, or GBEP, and our sustainability indicators for bioenergy, and also the links with the SDGs. Next, please. Thanks. So for those of you who don't know, but a brief recap for those who do, the Global Bioenergy Partnership, or GBEP, was established in 2005 by the G8 and then has received renewed mandates since then by the G7 and G20. The Secretariat is hosted in FAO, which is also a founding partner. But we have 38 partners and 46 observers between governments, as you can see in the map there, and also international organizations, where you can see some of the logos. Next, please. Thanks. So the big focus of GBEP and one of our specific task forces is on sustainability of bioenergy. And in 2011, GBEP produced the most widely recognized and agreed set of indicators for the assessment and monitoring of bioenergy. And they're intended to guide any analysis of bioenergy undertaken at the domestic level with a view to informing decision making and also facilitating the sustainable development of bioenergy. Some of the key points of the indicators, they cover all forms of bioenergy. They're voluntary, so not legally binding in any way. But they provide a very robust scientific basis for policy recommendations and then further policy formulation. And they also facilitate a harmonization of sustainability assessments across different regions and countries. Next, please. So here you can see the 24 indicators, and they're split across the 3 pillars: environmental, social, and economic. I'm not going to go into all of the details of each indicator here because of time, but if you could go next, please. Yeah, here you can see the 2 reports with all of the indicators. The respective methodology sheets are in both this first report on the left and also in the more recent implementation guide, which was released in January 2020. Next, please. So the GBEP indicators are measured over time, can show progress towards or away from a sustainable development path as it is determined nationally by that country. And they can also be used as an MNV tool, both for the nationally determined contributions in the Paris Agreement. Indicator 1 is specifically an LCA on GHG emissions, but also more broadly for the Sustainable Development Goals. Next, please. Thanks. And just to give you a little bit more detail on how they link together, some work was done in 2018 as a contribution to the partnership to show, detail the links between the GBEP indicators and the SDGs. And here you can see in the table some of those linkages. And all of the GBEP indicators from the environmental and social pillars and the majority from the economic pillar are linked with the SDGs and also their relevant targets and indicators. So for example, if we look at SDG 6 on water quality, water and sanitation, we can see that target 6.3 on improving water quality corresponds with the GBEP indicator number 6 on water quality. And again, target 6.4 on water use efficiency corresponds with GBEP indicator 5 on water use and efficiency. So due to these linkages, obviously the GBEP indicators can support data collection, but they can also help to demonstrate if the bioenergy sector or the value chain in a specific country is that's being studied positively or negatively contributes to the specific SDGs. Next, please. So one of the roles of GBEP is to harmonize the assessment of sustainability of bioenergy. So far, the indicators have been implemented in 14 countries, and here you can see in the map. And if you click next, there's just a sample of the reports from some of these implementations here. Obviously, I don't have time to go through all of them, but you can get a flavor for those. But the indicators are necessarily very data and resource intensive because they provide a very robust measurement of sustainability. Next, please. And this can create barriers to their uptake in countries where maybe resources and data are scarce. So therefore, facilitating the implementation of the indicators is an ongoing endeavor of the partnership. And we're currently developing a rapid implementation framework that should expedite the indicator measurement and make them more accessible. And the goal will be to eventually integrate this rapid implementation framework into an online platform that will also include automated data sheets. Next, please. Thanks. So just a few take-home messages. As we increase the use of bioenergy for net zero and also SDG 7 targets, there's going to necessarily be synergies and trade-offs with the achievement of other SDGs. And these interactions are not the same in all contexts. And so in-depth assessment in each situation is required to understand the specific sustainability circumstances. And in this, the GBEP indicators provide a harmonized approach to these assessments and can be integrated with national SDG monitoring frameworks as well. Above and beyond the indicators themselves, GBEP also provides an important forum for sharing of lessons learned between countries, allowing them to support robust policy development. So thank you very much. I'll pass the floor back over to you. Thanks.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Connie. I really appreciate your overview. Great, great presentation. And so with that, I will now turn things over to Andrea to present on the Biofuture principles. So Andrea, over to you.
Yes, hi, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. I would like to start with a few words about the Biofuture Platform, for those of you who are not aware of it. Next, please. So the Biofuture Platform is a 20-country multi-stakeholder initiative established in 2016 with the aim to accelerate the transition to a sustainable low-carbon bioeconomy. Since 2019, the IEA has been serving as a facilitator of the platform. You can see here the list of countries that are currently part of it and also the various partner organizations. And I would also like to point out that we've established under the umbrella of the Clean Energy Ministerial, a Biofuture Platform initiative last year. And we just launched last month a Biofuture campaign, still under the auspices of the Clean Energy Ministerial, as a way to foster an active private sector engagement. Next, please. So before getting into the details of this set of 5 principles for post-COVID bioeconomy recovery and acceleration that the Biofuture Platform developed last year, I would like to spend a little bit of time on the background and rationale for these principles. And I would like to draw your attention to an analysis and a report that was recently released by the IEA. You probably heard of it. It's called Net Zero by 2050 Roadmap. So as we know, over the past few years, and especially in recent months, a number of governments have announced net zero emission pledges, specifically by 2050. And the IEA has actually looked into what it would take to make this happen, to turn this into a reality. And once again, this report has highlighted the important role that bioenergy play and should play in the future to achieve these targets. In particular, modern bioenergy use should rise from around 60 exajoules in 2020 to over 100 exajoules in 2050. excluding actually traditional biomass use that in the meantime should be phased out, during this decade. This means that by 2050, modern bioenergy should account for almost 20% of total energy needs, becoming the second largest source of energy supply after solar. Next, please. Looking specifically at advanced biofuels, the production of advanced biofuels should accelerate dramatically compared to today's level. So as of 2020, they accounted for around 1% of total biofuel supply. This share is supposed to increase to almost half, so 45% more precisely, by 2030 and up to 90% in 2050, with a significant share of liquid biofuels then being used for aviation. So really a dramatic increase compared to today's level in order to make sure that these net zero emission pledges by 2050 really become a reality. Next, please. So what we just saw is what needs to happen. What should happen in the future in order to deliver on climate change targets. But what is happening actually on the ground? What is the data telling us? And specifically, what has been the impact of COVID-19 on the bioeconomy and specifically, in this case, bioenergy sector? Well, for the first time in 2020, biofuel production declined quite significantly. This was due to reduced transport activity with a resulting reduction in the demand from mandate policies. There were also low gasoline and diesel prices linked to historically low oil prices, which challenged the business case for biofuels. So it is in this context that these 5 principles I will describe to you briefly were developed. And even though we are seeing and we are expecting to see this year a rebound in biofuel production, these principles are still very current and relevant because we need to make sure that these rebound in biofuel production is robust, that it continues over time, and we actually need to create the conditions and an enabling environment for a significant acceleration in biofuel production over the coming decades. Next, please. The Biofuture principles were also informed by a study that the IEA prepared last year amidst the COVID-19 crisis, together with the IMF, which looked into a set of cost-effective measures for responding to the COVID crisis, specifically in the energy sector. Implementing these measures in the short term would have significant economic benefits in terms of economic growth, job creation, and actually greenhouse gas emission reduction. Next, please. And once again, this study highlighted the important role that bioenergy can play not only in achieving greenhouse gas emission reductions, but also in terms of other important sustainable development goals. Of course, SDG 7 with universal access to clean energy, but also SDG 8 on decent work, SDG 1 related to poverty, SDGs related to health and well-being, but particularly in this case, this study highlighted the important role that bioenergy has in terms of employment generation, being one of the most labor-intensive energy industries and employing already globally around 3 million people. So bioenergy, interestingly, has one of the largest number of jobs created per $1 million of investment. Next, please. So against this background, these 5 principles for post-COVID bioeconomy recovery and acceleration were developed under the Biofuture Platform. The first 2, and specifically the first one, is a strong signal that was sent to policymakers in terms of not backtracking. So ensuring continuity and long-term predictability of bioenergy, biofuels, and bio-based material targets and existing policy mechanisms. So of course, in order to especially during a crisis like the one we are still experiencing, it's key to maintain predictability to ensure the long-term investments that are needed. Next, please. Again, looking at the short-term issues faced by the bioeconomy and bioenergy sector specifically due to the COVID-19 health and economic crisis, there was an issue of liquidity for a lot of bioenergy industries. And so the recommendation here was, where appropriate, to address short-term challenges for bioenergy and bio-based materials industries in the context of the relief packages that were put in place over the past few months that are now in the process of being implemented. Again, to recover some of the losses that were suffered from the sector. Next, please. And then there is, looking more at the kind of longer term, this is a recommendation that has been already included in a number of reports by various organizations when looking at kind of the enabling environment for renewable energy deployment. So reassessing fossil fuel subsidies. So there was a window, there still is a window, especially last year with low oil prices. There's really the opportunity to reassess fossil fuel subsidies to finally create a fairer playing field for bio-based fuels, chemicals, and materials. Next, please.
So Andre, just a little time check. We have about a minute or two left.
I'm about to wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you.
The fourth principle is called Build Back Better with Bio. So this is really kind of promoting the inclusion of bioeconomy and bioenergy as part of recovery programs by requiring, for instance, bioeconomy investments and targets as part of the recovery packages, including for specific sectors such as transport and chemicals. And last but not least, the fifth principle, next please, is about sustainability. As you know, this is still an important issue that is pretty present in the debates surrounding bioeconomy and especially bioenergy. And this is about rewarding sustainability. So integrating sustainability rewarding mechanisms into policy frameworks and promoting the positive externalities that are associated with bioeconomy and bioenergy in the production and use of bio-based fuels, chemicals, and materials more broadly. So really acknowledging the multiple environmental, social, and economic benefits and co-benefits of bioenergy. Next, please. Next, please.
Andrea, it seems like our slide is just frozen for the person sharing their slides. You just sent me a note. So maybe I'll just get you to wrap up. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, sure, no problem, no problem. I just wanted to say that these principles were adopted as a result of a extensive consultation among our members, partners, and a number of external stakeholders as well. They informed a number of policy discussions and policy developments in key countries such as the US, Canada, Brazil, and that partly, let's say, inspired, among other things, by these principles, we recently launched a campaign, as I mentioned before, in the context of the Clean Energy Ministerial, which aims to bring together a number of lead governments and industries to advance the low carbon bioeconomy and promote the substitution of fossil fuels with their bio-based equivalents and alternatives in the production of fuels, chemicals, and materials. This campaign is open to interested countries, industries, NGOs, so we invite you to let us know in case you're interested in joining forces with us under this campaign. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I really appreciate your remarks, and I know
no problem. My time was over, so I thought it was actually a technique to.
No. we did this to make sure there's no technical glitches, and look, it still happens.
Sure, no problem. No problem at all. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. And at this point, we will turn things over to Luisa. And Luisa is going to share with us some work on the SD implementation within Europe. So we're just catching up with a new presenter. We found out our co-presenter power went off by the landlord. So we're improvising. Just give us 1 sec, Luisa, you can get yourself set up.
No problem.
There we go.
Okay,
Okay, we're
here
back
we
on
go.
track.
Yes, thank you very much. So I will give now an overview of how EU policies are mandated to implement SDGs. So how we in Europe and the Commission are implementing SDGs. Next slide, please. Since the very beginning, so we immediately, Europe immediately provided an answer to the Agenda 2030 already in November 2016 with this communication, Next Steps for a Sustainable European Future. And in this communication, there were two mandates. First one, to integrate SDGs into all EU policies and to launch a reflection on the long-term vision, so how we can move forward with a longer-term vision. And it also announced the need of developing an EU SDG monitoring system. And this request to reflect about the long-term vision was answered in January 2019 with these reflection papers towards a sustainable Europe by 2030, in which taking stocks of the level of achievements of SDGs in the EU, the Commission also identified challenges and enablers for SDGs achievement and define future scenarios. And within just a very short overview, but we arrive at the elections, and within the new Commission, since the Commission Work Programme, there is a reinforcement in the political ambitions and strategies, and in particular towards SDGs. This was well explained also in the staff working document published recently in December 2020, which gives central role to SDGs in all EU policies. Our president, Mrs. von der Leyen, clearly said in her opening speech, that SDGs will be our compass. So SDGs are really central for EU policies, in all policies. Next slide, please. So the sustainability is at the core of the 6 political ambitions of these new commissions that you can see here. And we provided this mapping of the 6 headline ambitions, so European Green Deal, the economy that works for people, Europe Fit for Digital Age, and so on and so forth. And each of these are is addressing several SDGs. And in particular, it's clearly explained in the staff working document and in Commission guidelines that sustainable development is a core principle of the Treaty of the European Union and a priority objective for all the Union's internal and external policies. So there is a request, an intrinsic part of the President's political program to have SDGs at the heart of the policy making. And she explicitly requested all commissioners to ensure the delivery of SDGs within their policy area, and also to refocus and integrate SDG fully in the EU semester, which is the economic and financial framework for the member states. So clearly there is a strong mandate, next please, which is even further reinforced in the better regulation agenda. The better regulation gives the indication for EU policy making, and it's a very important document for policymakers. And the new communication has just been released, and it focuses on the request of mainstreaming SDGs in all EU policies since the executive summary and all the policy phases. And gives also indications on how to design and evaluate EU policies transparently, comprehensively with respect to SDGs, based on scientific evidence, but also very important, unveiling synergies and trade-offs, so interlinkages among SDGs to avoid burden shiftings in all the policy steps, as I mentioned already. Next, please. So now I give an overview of our work to try to help policymakers in mainstreaming SDGs into their EU policies. We have developed a methodology. We made a mapping on all policies in the Juncker's Commission, as well as in the new von der Leyen Commission. So the database includes more than 3,000 policies, and it's updated legislative and non-legislative documents, and it's updated to May 2021. So we just released the new update. And we used text mining techniques based on the keywords approach and the script developed in Python, and to map any kind of policy text towards SDGs at goals and target level. As you can see here in the bubble chart on the left, you see an overview of the policies at goal level, but if you go over on each SDG, you can see the at target level. And then on the right part of the figure, you can see that for each policy, and this is a huge database, we can show which are the SDGs that are directly mentioned in the policy, touched in the policy. We have defined more than 3,000 keywords for targets level and almost 300 at goals level. And then if you click on the policy, you see the Sankey diagrams, which tells you also which are the targets addressed by each policy. So this big database is available in our platform, and it's just been recently released. Next, please. And I give you now some examples. For example, I extracted from the database in our research the results for the Renewable Energy Directive, the updated Renewable Energy Directive, and where you can see that, well, quite a broad range of SDGs are mentioned, are touched, not explicitly mentioned, but touched by the policies, with, of course, a predominance of SDG 7, clean and affordable energy, but also very important SDG 13 on climate change, as well as the protection and restoration of ecosystems on land in particular, but also on water. Next, please. I give also an overview of the new bioeconomy strategy. I'm part of the bioeconomy unit, so it's very important for us. And again, the bioeconomy framework captures almost all the SDGs and their targets, as highlighted in the Sankey diagram on the right. Next, please. So the bioeconomy, as it is defined in the bioeconomy strategy, cover all sectors and systems that rely on biological sources, including their functions and their principles. And similarly to the SDGs, therefore, the bioeconomy merits really an holistic view. In the case of the bioeconomy, we need to cover all steps of the value chain, all sectors that rely on the biological sources, and we really need to highlight the synergies and the trade-offs among them, among all sectors and among all impacts. The EU bioeconomy strategy indicates 5 main objectives that are listed in this slide here, that are needed for a sustainable circular bioeconomy. And what we did, besides linking the strategy itself to the SDG framework, we also tried to link SDGs to each of these objectives. Next slide, please. As you can see here, again, almost each of the SDGs can be linked to at least one of the bioeconomy strategy objectives. So the bioeconomy, the way it is conceived in Europe, is really holistic, but also it's really taking sustainable development, sustainability at the core of the policy. And next slide, please. We are also in charge of developing the monitoring framework of the bioeconomy. This is a mandate that we received from the bioeconomy strategy. We at the JRC in my unit. And we have defined a list of more than 100 indicators. And this has been done through a participatory process with several workshops open to various stakeholders, expert scientists, and also representatives of governments, etc. And within this list, several indicators are already existing in other frameworks. For example, indicators in the SDGs framework, or indicators already mentioned in the CAP, in the Common Agricultural Policy, etc. And these indicators have been gradually incorporated into our dashboard of indicators. And this dashboard is accessible through our Knowledge Center for the Bioeconomy. But what I want to show here is that the indicators are all mapped again against SDGs to facilitate the search for SDG specific indicators. And again, I wish to underline how well the SDG framework, well, actually the other way around, the bioeconomy indicators framework is addressing the SDGs set. What you see here is not definitely the list of indicators, which is available in the dashboard in the website, but it's the broader normative criteria in which the indicators that we are developing are sitting. So you see how the normative criteria, which are the basis for our indicators, are really addressing SDGs. And I had only a few minutes for this presentation, so I close here. You have all the references in the next slide. I will update by adding also the link to the Knowledge Center of the Bioeconomy, where you can find the dashboard of bioeconomy indicators and the links to SDGs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luisa. You covered lots of ground, and thank you so much for sharing your insights. And with that, we will move to our last presentation for this first grouping. So I'll turn things over to Jean, and we'll hear from you. Over to you, Jean.
Thank you, Barb, and thanks so much to everyone for being here today. Uwe gave a really good overview of the IEA Bioenergy Strategic Intertask Project on the contribution of bioenergy and biomass production systems to SDG implementation. And as he mentioned, this workshop was arranged as a sub-activity of that particular project. And over the next few minutes, I'm going to just very briefly present the results of the first two sub-activities of the project, which consisted of a literature review and compilation of best practice case studies. Next slide, please. So as we've heard, biomass production is expected to increase significantly to meet temperature targets set out in the Paris Agreement. And there's sort of a general concern that the projected increase in biomass production for bioenergy could potentially result in some negative unintended consequences. So the overall aim of the Intertask project, as you've mentioned, was to sort of expand knowledge and understanding of biomass production systems that contribute positively to multiple SDGs in order to inform landscape design and management practices that will enhance the sustainable production of biomass while delivering multiple societal benefits. So first, we needed to understand the potential impacts of bioenergy and biomass production systems on SDGs in order to then start to identify some of the best practices from around the world for different supply chains for the sustainable production of biomass for bioenergy generation. So the first thing we did was, next slide, please, thank you. First thing we did was a sort of broad scan of literature for studies or reports that drew explicit linkages between bioenergy and biomass supply chains and SDGs. And we identified several reports that provided sort of a high-level overview of the possible ways that bioenergy and related supply chains could potentially impact SDGs in general around the world. And there's sort of a general agreement, and I think we've seen this in the previous presentations as well, that the SDGs that are most likely to be impacted by biomass production for bioenergy, in addition to SDG 7, are the goals related to land and resource management, climate change and sustainable industry, and economic growth. And while other SDGs are less likely to be impacted, but in any case, the specific impacts are going to be location and supply chain or sort of context specific. Next slide, please. So building on this sort of high-level literature review, the next step was to characterize the potential interactions between bioenergy and biomass supply chains and SDGs beyond SDG 7. So we did a scan of literature that looked at sort of the various sustainability impacts of biomass production systems and bioenergy development in order to identify the potential impacts that expanded production of biomass for bioenergy could have on the SDGs for biomass produced from different sources. We found that it's not common, at least not yet, and as our previous presenter was outlining, I think we're going to see more and more that the SDGs are sort of used as a framework for assessing the sustainability of bioenergy and biomass supply, but it wasn't common, or it's not common in the literature yet, for the SDGs to be used as a framework. So we looked at sustainability assessments using various different indicators, and then drew the connections between the sustainability indicators used and the SDGs ourselves, with some input from other experts as well. And then we carried out a scoring exercise at the target level, and then summarized it in the figure here, just at the SDG level for simplicity. And looking at the figure, the length of the line sort of indicates the strength of the interaction, with the longer line indicating sort of more of a direct interaction, and a shorter line more of an indirect interaction. And the lighter color bars show the potential impacts of sort of bioenergy generation in general, not directly linked to the supply chain necessarily, while the darker bars indicate the impacts or potential impacts that are specifically related to biomass production and supply. And many of these you'll see are related to land use and resource management. So it's these sort of supply chain interactions that sort of vary most between different supply chains, but also that we're sort of most interested in discussing today. So our next step, once we've done, thanks Barb, once we've done sort of a scan of the literature, was to identify a collection of best practice case studies from around the world for different supply chains and at different scales that exemplified how biomass production could be sustainably increased in a way that leads to multiple societal benefits, while minimizing, or ideally eliminating, any negative impacts on society and ecosystems. Next slide, please. So this graph just shows sort of a summary of the contributions to SDGs across the case studies, and it's clear that indeed there are multiple positive impacts on the SDG realized when these best practices are implemented. And in several cases, in several of the case studies, there was maybe a potential for negative impacts noted, but there was mechanisms in place, such as sort of monitoring and measurement of water quality, for example, that have been put in place to safeguard against any negative impacts, such that in the case studies that we looked at anyways, there were no recorded negative impacts, as there was sort of best practices in place to mitigate them. And while all cases are unique, there were some common themes among them. For example, biomass production systems tended to be integrated into land and resource management systems in a way that complements and not competes with existing production systems. And they tended to involve close cooperation and partnerships amongst multiple stakeholders along the supply chain. Next slide, please. So we've sort of taken this work as far as we can based on literature and a collection of best practice case studies. So we're now looking to hear from experts, all of you that are in the group today. And as you'll soon hear, the upcoming breakout session, the activity will be based around identifying and discussing the most important, or maybe most likely positive and negative impacts of biomass supply for bioenergy on the SDGs for different supply chains. And as you're thinking about the most important impacts, I would also encourage you to start thinking about how the positive impacts can be maximized and negative impacts mitigated, as this is where the discussion will shift to tomorrow as we start to think about best practices. So thank you all again for being here, and I'll turn it back over to Bruno, I believe. We might have a couple minutes left for questions.
Lovely, thank you, Jean. And thank you so much for all of the questions coming into chat. Presenters, I encourage you to have a good look through chat, and if you are able to respond to some of these questions, that would be great. Participants, as you're posing the question, if you have the opportunity to just add the name so that it's a little bit easier for presenters to find the questions that they're being asked, that would be a really helpful measure. So just going forward, perhaps direct the questions to a particular panelist or presenter. And at this point, I'm wondering, Bruno, if you might want to come up. There's lots of good questions in there, some very directed to the presenters, but perhaps there's one or two just before we pause for break that we could ask for some feedback on.
Yeah, Barb, there were quite a few around monitoring and assessment of either biomass supply or bioenergy more generally. So maybe it's a question for Luisa and Connie, in terms of how do we make sure monitoring and assessment first is done, and secondly is done consistently and allows comparability between different supply chains or between different countries, or even allows comparison with non-bio, for example, fossil-based solutions.
Louisa, do you want to go first, or shall I? You're muted.
Now go first, Connie, because I don't fully get what is the question addressed to me regarding this part. But
Okay, yes.
Go first, and then I will clarify for sure.
Okay, so I think that I understood what Bruno was talking about. I mean, it's really difficult. I saw a comment in the chat from Emily from the US talking about the unnecessary burden, let's say, of to people from doing these kinds of assessments and trying to comply with a lot of indicators or directives. At least with the GBEP indicators, as I mentioned, they're voluntary. I mean, we do have a really strong focus on harmonizing across countries, but I think, and I mentioned also in the chat, and I put especially for the LCA for GHG emissions, we do have this GHG clearinghouse that is not necessarily looking to harmonize approaches, because I think that would be extremely difficult, but at least to be able to compare the different approaches and the different methodologies and allow people to see where different methodologies have been used. But I think it's a difficult point. Yeah, I think have I answered your question, Bruno?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree that it's a difficult point for sure, and there are challenges remaining, like for how we monitor or assess progress or performance of bio in the bioeconomy sphere. Louisa, maybe insights from what you've been doing at the JRC on monitoring and assessing biomass supply.
Yes. Well, yes, we, as I mentioned, we are developing this monitoring framework for the EU bioeconomy. So the set of indicators that we are developing is, I mean, we are developing this really with an inclusive approach. So we had so many workshops, and actually some of the participants to this workshop were also invited to discuss with us how to build this monitoring framework. We are working with GBEP as well and FAO to have a coherent as far as possible, because of course the scope is quite different, but to have a coherent monitoring framework to monitor the bioeconomy. So what is really, I also get the question made by Francis about sustainable trade. What we are really keen in doing is to guarantee the full coverage, or at least as broad as possible coverage of all the three sustainability pillars. And therefore, that's why it's very important to link to all the SDGs and try to see if the three pillars are all, I wouldn't say equally, but really covered. Regarding sustainable trade, well, indeed, this is something very important, because what could be our view has to be confronted with the local and nationalistic views, as Francis is saying. And that's why it's important to discuss with the broadest variety, the largest variety of experts, not only scientists, but also policymakers, stakeholders, different stakeholders from different industrial side, as well as having a full geographic scope coverage, so that to guarantee that the monitoring framework, the way we are monitoring the development of our bioeconomy, is really in line with sustainability principles. That's, I don't know if it answers to your question. Well, there is not a unique answer. It's more a comment because it's indeed a very important aspect to be taken into consideration.
Thank you, Luisa. So maybe one final question, and again, questions can be asked directly in the chat room for specific speakers. So a question from Jorge and perhaps Jean and Jim can provide insights on this one. So how do we look beyond only bioenergy and look at in the biorefining concept, look at the different products that can be produced from biomass, and what does this mean when we are paying specific attention to contribution to SDGs from biomass supply and the bioeconomy?
Do you want to go first, Jim?
Yeah, I can have a go at that, I guess. And for people that don't realize it, the OECD and the IEA are sister organizations. And when I joined in 2011, I was told, you do not look at energy, that's the IEA. And IEA does not look at chemistry, that's you. So for me, it's a kind of artificial distinction because I come from petrochemistry as well as bio. I used to work in Saudi Arabia in the oil industry. And one of the things I knew when I came to the job was for a typical chemical, 80% of the cost of production is energy. So, but I like this idea that people start to focus outside energy because, you know, a lot of my focus is carbon capture and utilization nowadays, because we work in sectors where there is value added. So if we say that the cement and steel and chemistry are the three largest industry sectors for emissions, then if we get to carbon neutrality, we've got to address all of these. And that's been a kind of focus a lot of my work, is to say we need to see a little more emphasis on the sector outside of energy. So that's what I'm trying to say about this analysis we do on SDGs. There are many areas where biotechs can contribute, but also we know that chemistry has forever been an engine of innovation, and we know that the chemical sector is getting its head around these ideas. For example, I believe BASF has, at least at pilot scale, a route to zero emissions methanol. And if anybody knows methanol, once you get to there are many places you can go. So that's, I hope that kind of answers the question, but I'd like to put back a little bit more of a question myself, actually, in this whole thing, is how do we start this conversation about the other sectors? When I was doing some research recently on biopharmaceuticals, I was staggered to read that the pharma industry might be of the same order of emissions as automotive, not transport, but automotive. So there are a lot of industries out there that we need to start addressing. And one of the things that always strikes me about these conversations about indicators is when I talk to companies, they say we want the minimum set of indicators that we have to work with because it's expensive. So is there an approach? I think the FAO has an approach which minimizes the indicators that companies would work with, rather than, you know, at the sort of country and transnational side of things. So I kind of hope that answers that question about other sectors.
Thank you, Jim. Jean, any further thoughts?
I would agree with Jim that a lot of the attention often is on energy and fuels, and I think there's lots of opportunity for other chemicals, pharmaceuticals, et cetera, to be made from biomass, and that opportunity is starting to be realized, especially in sort of certain circles, but still certainly in Canada at the policy level, the focus is on bioenergy and fuels. So just making sure that that doesn't take away from the other opportunities, but I think there's certainly, I mean, there's lots of fiber out there, and there's certainly enough for the two, both energy and materials, to be integrated. And I think in many cases, bioenergy is going to power the sort of the biorefining sector. But it's important that there are sort of incentives and mechanisms in place for the materials, pharmaceuticals, chemical companies to get involved in the bioeconomy as well, because there's lots of things such as clean fuel standards, that sort of thing, that are sort of incentivizing the energy sector to get involved. It's just important to sort of take that integrated view and make sure that one's not left behind.
Thank you, Jean. Barb, I think we're ready to go to the break.
Yes, that's right. Good. Thank you. And big round of applause. Thanks to all of the different presenters this morning for preparing your materials, for engaging in the chat. Thank you for that. I know it was a tall order to put things together so quickly. So it's so much great information in such a short time. So thank you for that. So it's just 6 minutes after the hour where I am. I imagine that's the same for you. How about we take about an 8 or 9 minute break, go stretch your legs, come back at 1/4 after the hour. And when we come back, we'll introduce the breakout group discussions. Just a reminder, folks, please do not hit the red leave button. Stay logged in. Just turn off your video and your mic for the moment. And we'll reconnect at 1/4 after the hour. Thanks, everyone. See you in a few moments. Back. Hope you had a chance to just stretch your legs and get a quick refreshment, and we'll continue on with our workshop. Fortunately, we don't get to meet each other in person like we might normally do. So we have ahead of us breakout groups. And so this is our best effort at having the opportunity for you to meet one another. So I'd just like to introduce the concept of the breakout group. So if we could go ahead to the next slide, we'll provide an overview to help situate your conversations. So today's breakout groups are organized by supply chain. So you may recall when you registered at the time for participating in this workshop, you were given the choice of which supply chain you'd like to participate in, whether it be forestry, agriculture, waste, or other. And we've done our best to try and make sure we've got either your first or second choice. So if you can imagine yourself moving into a breakout group conversation shortly where you're oriented your discussion around that particular supply chain. And what we're inviting people to do in their groups is to reflect on the Sustainable Development Goals. And we've had a lot of really great introductory remarks to help spark our thinking around those. Think of those SDG goals and think about your supply chain. And the conversation we'd like you to have is, as you think about that supply chain, whether it be forestry or agriculture, how does that supply chain actually positively influence the ability to reach a certain sustainable development goal? What's helping to contribute? What are some of the co-benefits that that particular supply chain offers? And then we'd also like you to sort of think on the flip side of the supply chain. What is it that perhaps is negatively impacting the achievement of that SDG, of one of the SDGs? And so in your groups, we have a facilitator who will help guide the conversation. And we have a note taker who will help navigate the use of mural. And so what I would like to do is we'll transition you in, and you're going to be invited to use that tool mural. So some of you may have had a chance to play around with it a little bit over the last few days in the test one we shared with you. We encourage you to receive the link that's going to come through in your breakout group chat and open that up so you too can participate. It's just as if we were in a room and we're writing sticky notes down on a wall to gather as much information and insight as we can. And so that's some of the mechanics. We have about 55 minutes for this conversation. We'll be giving some time signals to your breakout group leaders so they know when things are to wrap up. And when we hear back from each group, we'll just get a couple of high-level ideas about what you discussed, perhaps what the SDGs are that you think are positively or negatively impacted by a particular supply chain type. And so with that, maybe just to help illustrate it a little bit more, Bruno, maybe I can just get you to walk through an example for us, just to help people's mindsets as they move into the breakout group. So Bruno?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Thanks, Barb. So here you see 2 examples where we have an SDG on the left. So the first one is SDG 2 on zero hunger, and the other one below is SDG 6 on clean water and sanitation. So like biomass supply chains can have both positive and negative impacts on those SDGs. So for agricultural residues in the first example, so you have a co-benefit when you direct crop residues to bioenergy instead of burning them on the field or landfilling them, and plus you can make better use of the equipment that's mainly used for harvesting. But also, if you remove too much or if you remove it on an unsustainable way, then you can impact soil quality. So this is a good example where there could be both a benefit, but also a negative impact from using agricultural residues for bioenergy. The second one is on forest biomass. Again, as it relates to water quantity or quality, there is a positive impact that can occur from reforestation if the biomass comes from areas that are being reforested to provide the biomass for multiple purposes, including energy. But then if the harvesting operations are carried out in such a way that you use excessive fertilizers or you apply pesticides in a way that impact the water bodies, then you would have a negative impact on water quality. So those are 2 examples of topics we could address in the breakout groups, and the purpose is really to get more of those and get your perspectives on which SDGs are the most important and how they can be impacted by biomass supply.
Great, thank you so much, Bruno. So with that, we'll leave you in the good hands of the breakout group leaders and their support team to do a quick round of introductions, quick discussion on the SDGs that are relevant, and then really hear your inputs on the positives and the negative impact. So I think what we'll plan to do is return at about 1/4 the hour. So it just gives you about 55 minutes, heads up to the facilitators. We'll be popping into your room though to make sure everything is going well. Note takers, you should have access to the Ask for Help button, the little question mark in your breakout group, should you have any difficulty. And so with that, Rebecca, are we good to move people into the rooms?
Yep, we're ready.
Okay, so let's go ahead. You should be swiftly moved into your room. Enjoy your conversations. Thanks so much. Looks like we have a few folks here just making their way in. If anyone's having trouble that's here connected to this room here in plenary, just come off mute and we'll try and help troubleshoot with you.
Kelsey, I just sent that.
Maybe we can just do a quick pop into each room, Kelsey, right now while Rebecca and I are troubleshooting, and maybe Chris could too.
Pause the recording.
Yes, please.
Sorry, Rebecca, I thought you were doing it.
Lorenzo, I see you're next.
Hi, Lorenzo De Lucia. I'm a research fellow. I work at Imperial College in London, and I'm a visiting fellow at Chalmers University in Sweden.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Christian.
Hello, everybody. I am Christian. I'm from Guatemala. I work in Central Agricola. It's a local company to research and investment and biogas project. We have already one plant from management, like poultry manure. Hello, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, Christian. So we are going now to Ana Maria.
Good afternoon for you. Good morning for us. My name is Ana Maria Majano. I work for the Let's Slack regional platform, which is the regional platform for Latin America and the Caribbean of the Let's Global Partnership, and I coordinate the bioenergy community of practice. So we are a space for exchange of knowledge and experiences and capacity building with the purpose of promoting policy development, business models, the use of tools for sustainable bioenergy development in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Thank you, Ana Maria. So what we will do now is go into the mural tool as Barb mentioned. So Jean-Martin just pasted the link in the chat room. So you should be seeing the link to access the app.
The top 3 potential positive impacts of forest biomass supply chains for bioenergy. And then we'll do sort of the same thing for the potential negative impacts. So I just ask you to take a couple minutes and just sort of think to yourselves, Laurent, do you have the link handy there? It was in the post, it was in the chat earlier. You might still be able to see it actually. There's just a link there to the UN's website that sort of goes over the SDGs if you just need a refresher on what some of the goals are. Take a quick look at that and sort of just think about which SDGs might be most positively impacted or might be most important to think about when we're thinking about co-benefits of forest bioenergy supply chains.
For the low carbon resilient development strategy of Colombia. I'm working as a coordinator of the mines and energy issues from the strategy. So of course, everything related to biomass and bioenergy is one of the most important topics to work on in the following years for us. So that's why I'm here. Actually, my big experience is about, of course, energy but mainly agricultural wastes. So I know that I will learn a lot from you from this group. So very happy to be here.
Thank you, Oscar, and thank you all. I forgot to introduce myself, Uwe Fritsche. I'm the scientific director of INAS, an international research institute in different countries. And I also work with IEA Bioenergy in the task 40 and 45. I'm a physicist by training, so my understanding of trees is rather simplistic, let's say. I like them in large numbers so that we can model them. Well, you see in the chat that what we do now sounds a bit strange, but for talking and seeing each other, we stay in this breakout group, but for working and taking a look what's actually happening, we are using the mural board, a virtual whiteboard. And in the chat, you see a link. Andrew gave us that, so I ask you, unless you haven't done it already, to click on that link, which brings you to our virtual whiteboard. And there you have avatars. Some of you have already linked to it. That's good. And you see the cursor of Andrew pulling around. And basically, this is just for note taking, like we have a flip chart. Okay. And I would just start with our task to discuss what are the major SDGs in terms of possible.
Oh, hard to read from the zoom out position because we can zoom in and capture all the text or all the information you provide in each box. So I would encourage you to go at it, start writing down ideas or input under each of those SDGs, typically the ones you voted for, but also the other ones as well. Is it clear to everyone?
May I ask a question?
Yeah, Annie, yeah.
Oh, we don't just go for the top 3 that were chosen. We explain why we chose the ones we chose.
I mean, if you see or if you can provide examples or explanation on why you see, even though it wasn't in your top 3, you can still provide input, of course. But I would assume you would start by the ones you selected yourself. But you can provide input under any of those 3 SDGs up there.
Okay, but if 2 of mine weren't up there, and I feel more strongly about the other ones, I think what you might be seeing here, if I could just make a little comment.
Yeah.
If you work in a more developing environment, things like poverty would be more important than climate action. So I'm then responding more to an agenda that's not quite where we are, you know, if you know what I mean.
Okay, so what can be done is also to move one of those yellow post-its next to the other SDGs to consider. So if no poverty and zero hunger were your 2 top choices, plus another one, then yeah, you can provide input under this box, and we can also capture it this way, if that works for you, Annie.
Okay, sure, thank you. Thank you very much.
Create jobs and maybe some sort of some resilience against natural disasters such as fire, if that biomass is instead used for energy, which can sort of indirectly contribute to reducing poverty.
But also brings, you establish industry associated with these kind of raw materials, and you can increase also indirect jobs.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah, indirect jobs sort of all along the supply chain and just sort of supporting the industry in general. What for SDG 8? So we've got a few ideas around job creation, which again was sort of indirectly tied to SDG 1 as well. Cascading of wood, certainly improved resource use efficiency. Would anyone like to speak more to any of those points?
So Jean, I wasn't able to actually get anything in there because for my computer's not behaving, but
okay.
I think that the nice thing about biomass, you know, in whatever form you're talking about, is that it is very labor intensive. There's not really a super efficient way at going at using this resource compared to other renewable energy resources. You're always going to have more jobs, and that's better for local economies because, you know, it's hard to outsource cutting of trees. It's hard to outsource that kind of hands-on management side of things. There are some notes in there though that, you know, a lot of those jobs are not necessarily good jobs, and this is supposed to be decent work and economic growth. So a big part of implementing number 8 is making sure that benefits accrue on site rather than somewhere else. I know we get into that discussion a little bit later when we go to the bottom half of this chart. But I think that that's really the critical thing. There could be lots of jobs and they could be good jobs, but to get there, you've got to create some buffers around the edges. You've got to put some rules in place that basically ensure that those jobs happen and that they are compensated properly.
Thank you, Warren. And the other ideas that we've got here sort of cluster around this idea of improved resource use efficiency and cascading use of biomass through maybe several industrial chains. So, you know, high value wood or the sort of highest quality wood going to probably solid bioproducts or solid wood products, and then cascading through to maybe some other chemicals, pulp, paper, that sort of thing, with sort of the residues being used for energy. And certainly there are targets within SDG 8 that have to do with sort of improving resource use efficiency and reducing our material footprint. So definitely use of forest biomass for bioenergy can do all of those things, as long as we are taking this cascading approach and not just sort of clear cutting forests for energy, which we all know doesn't happen, but a lot of people seem to think that it does, or at least maybe it does in some places, but not Europe and North America and most of the places where we're sort of most familiar with, probably. Does anyone else have anything to add around this idea of cascading and resource use efficiency?
We are looking into something called biomass utilization campuses, where the waste of one industry can be used by the following one. So in that way, you are integrating the total use of biomass.
In the basket of biomass possibilities, to find a place for this type of wood, for this type of resources, Canadian industry is not used at. So for the beginning, that's what I can say.
So if I understood you correctly, and Andrew may put that in the notes, one reason for the plantations you referred to was actually soil erosion control. So that and that you reduce the effluence to rivers, so there's a water quality implication. Is it correct?
Yeah, water quality, because it was usually biosolid from municipalities were sent. I take what I'm saying with caution. Was sent in the nature.
Tu peux parler en français et je peux traduire.
Yeah, les résidus solides okay, I will try to say it in English. So biosolid from municipalities for us in my house, everything I'm using and everything going into them all the water sludge going from my home and from all houses were kind of sent into the nature. So the main idea was to use that as fertilizer. So that's how it started. When I started working with Natural Resources Canada 3 years ago, the project was kind of it was an ongoing project, but at that point, there was no projection into what will we do once we harvest. We harvest will after 3 years. But there was no projection, no projection of what will we do. So for example, what was harvested, I think 2 years ago, was just burnt. Because no sound plan was made on finding better use for that resources. So now, as we want to develop a solid bioeconomy industry, we are saying, okay, but we do have these resources and we can even have more resources because, for example, here in Alberta, most of our energy comes from coal mine, but we will close all the coal mine. I don't want to say, I don't want to give a wrong year. I can give it maybe in 5 minutes. I will look exactly at the right year, but we are planning to close the coal mine in very near future. So last year we started thinking, okay, since we'll be closing the coal mine, people working there will no more have work. So now we are thinking on planting willow, where first to reclaim the land, this is the main objective, but second, to continue using the plant, the existing coal plant, but instead of burning coal, burning willow. But at the very, very beginning, the only purpose was to reclaim land using biosolid as fertilizer. That's why I said in French, mettre la charrue devant les bœufs, because we planted and only now we are thinking on what we'll be doing with the planted trees. That's for the short rotation. And for the traditional forestry, we are facing a tremendous amount of mill closure. So there, the point is more on finding innovative way to use the resources we now realize they are not that endless as we thought maybe 20 years ago.
Thank you, Cyriac. So I guess there is, especially in the last one you mentioned, there is also a positive trade-off to employment, to jobs, maintaining that if you phase out the coal. So we will sort this in. Time-wise, we may shift now. Some of you have already done so to the negative impacts, but I wouldn't leave out Oscar and Francis to make their comments on, if you still have a view on the positive impacts, it's now time to share it with the group. Maybe Oscar, you can start.
Yeah. Well, I have some ideas, obviously because of my background. So I will tell about that. So of course, the first of all must be the SDG number 7, that is the affordable and clean energy, due to the fact that, of course, it will become one of the non-renewable sources that we can use, especially in a country like us, where our power matrix is almost clean, 70%, but of course we need more renewable sources, right? Of course, it depends on how it's gonna be done, you know? I mean, it must be between an agreement between private sector, public sector, and of course, communities. Just to give you an example, here we have one of the biggest companies.
So Chris is in room 2. Conversation for people. I commend you on your bravery of trying a new technology. I do hope that you had a chance to give your input and your thoughts. Let's continue to use chat to round out our conversations. We just had a side conversation with one of our participants, and like, Zoom just gets more complicated every month as we go along. And so thank you for your participation and trying out mural as a tool. There's so many rich ideas, and we're trying to find an efficient way to get them together, and hope you found a way to contribute. So at this time, I think what we'd like to do is just get a little flavor of kind of what was the nature of your conversation, maybe one or two key messages from your group, perhaps just even list out the SDGs that you identified. And we know that all the rich conversation is captured in the mural notes, and so we'll continue to hold those. But just to give us a flavor of what you discussed, I'd really appreciate that. And perhaps maybe I can start with you, the agriculture group. So maybe Connie, maybe I'll go to you first and then Daniela to just give us a little bit of a taste. And Connie, if you'd like, I think Chris can share his screen, or if you're set up to share your screen, you can go ahead and do that.
What would be better, Chris? Would you like me to share? Ah, okay, he's done it.
Okay, there you go. And we'll zoom in a little bit. You just tell us what you want
we
to
are
zoom.
Group B. So the other ag group.
There we go.
Great, thanks.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so as you can see from our group, the three positive, the highest ranked, let's say, SDGs for the positive impacts from agricultural supply chains were 12, 13, and 8, and the negative 15, 2, and 6. So instead of going into a lot of the details of the specific comments, I think really some of the core messages were from our group. We're really talking about how difficult it is to actually do this task. Because as you'll notice from a lot of our sticky notes, they all have a lot of caveats. They're all quite aspirational. In a lot of cases, some of the things we're talking about could be both positive and negative, depending on the specific context. And a lot of these, at least the positive ones, are not maybe the actual. They require quite a lot of additional efforts or conditions to achieve them. So if you want, I just pull out a few core ones that we discussed maybe. As you can see in number 12 on responsible consumption and production, there were quite a lot of discussion on efficient use of resources in terms of reducing waste. For 13, we're looking at mostly the substitution of fossil-based energy, but then there were also discussions in terms of use of agricultural residues or different types of energy crops as well, and the best practices in terms of producing those. And then we discussed in 8, which is where the sort of aspirational points came in, because it does have the opportunity to improve rural livelihoods, create market diversification, also improve tenure rights, but it's really requires the right context and the right additional efforts to realize those. Then in terms of the negative ones, again, we discussed quite in depth the context specificity of a lot of these potential negative impacts on the SDGs. So as you can see from both 15 and 6, there were comments in terms of saying planting the wrong crops. So if you plant the wrong crops or you have the wrong types of irrigation, then this can deplete not only water resources, but also life on land. Talked about intensive agriculture having negative impacts, not only in terms of biomass for bioenergy, but just in general. And we also talked quite in depth about SDG 2 on zero hunger, trying to maybe move away from this this view of the food versus fuel debate, and instead talking about the sustainable management of resources, but really decoupling this this idea from the fact of zero hunger, given that no hunger is not going to be directly linked to production and use of resources. So really trying to decouple those two concepts. So it's quite difficult to condense what we said in just a few minutes, but I hope I've done a good job. And if anyone in our group would like to add anything in the chat, then please do. So I won't have gone through everything. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Connie. Great summary. And yes, lots of good concepts and making the connection. So thank you. So I will turn to Daniela, and your group, Daniela, also talked about agriculture. So just perhaps a quick overview. It looks like there were some similarities maybe in the SDGs that you chose. So Chris, if you can zoom in, and Daniela, if you can come online. Jean, you'll be up next, then Huva on forestry. But right now, Daniela.
Yeah, thank you. I'm online. Maybe Søren can share the screen that we see some of our results. So we have focused on SDGs number 2, 13 and 15, and we looked for them in both ways, in positive and negative ways, and I tried to summarize the results on the right hand side, but I didn't manage to do it complete. So let's start with our main findings. What we saw, a lot of options for improving the situation for zero hunger when the agriculture system is improved. And this is the most important co-benefit. So if we, for example, reduce food waste problems, closing the yield gaps, increase income for farmers, get access to energy, or also optimize storage options, these are all important co-benefits which might reduce zero hunger. But again, I agree with the former group, it's strongly context specific, and one of the biggest problem is, we called it, if the prices develop in the wrong way, or if we do the whole biomass for bioenergy on the wrong place. This is quite the same direction as the former speaker. Then of course we have much more negative in aspects. With regard to climate actions, we got two important core messages. One is there are positive benefits all along the agriculture production chain, co-benefits, and especially if we again do look for upstream and downstream, and this means making better use of soil sinks, producing additional co-products with better CO2 performances, reducing waste problems from agriculture, reducing fertilizer demands, going for new systems like genome editing, crop fertilizer, etc., crops, sorry. So a lot of co-benefits for LCA all along the chain are possible. And here, and also with regard to chances, especially for life on land, which is strongly related to biodiversity, we see chances, again, if we stabilize the agricultural or farmer situation for at the location, if we improve management, and this can, for example, happen with stable prices. But the big negative risk is if we just go for standard agriculture expansion, we will have a lot of negative impacts for life and land, for climate action, and I think also for zero hunger. So standard agriculture expansion, price increase, and wrong places are the three big problems. And in our last, let's say, voting, we saw zero hunger and the climate action are the most important SDGs from our point of view with regard to the agriculture supply chain. So far, my reporting back, and if I forgot something, I kindly ask the group to add.
Lovely, thank you, Danielle. And I really like the fact that you looked at the positive and negatives of those three, sort of the compare and contrast about those 3 SDGs. So thank you for that, and thank you to your group and to Soren for helping out so well. Thank you. So Jean, I'll go to you. So now we have 2 groups that are reporting on the forestry supply chain. So Jean, you first, and then Huva, you're on deck. Jean?
Okay, so the top 3 positive impacts that we identified were on 1, 8, and 13. There was lots of others in there as well. 15, 9, for example, came up from a few people. But I think some of the key messages around this were really sort of the opportunities for job creation along the supply chain, particularly in sort of rural or more remote areas where there may be less opportunities in general for jobs. And another point that came up though was that the jobs that are created aren't always sort of considered decent jobs, or they might not be compensated for properly. So just ensuring that any jobs that are created are properly compensated for and contribute to sort of positive development and reduce poverty. Around SDG 8, again, some ideas around job creation, but also just the improved use or efficiency of resource use, and this idea of cascading that came up in the plenary at the beginning as well, where it allows for sort of more value to be added to the overall forest resource, as long as you're taking sort of the highest value and carbon storing products first, and then cascading down to energy from some of the residues. SDG 13 was identified as by others as either positive, could be either positive or negative, just sort of depending how the forest is managed and how biomass is either harvested or collected from the forest. There certainly are examples where forest biomass harvest for energy has resulted in improved management practices that might reduce the risk of forest fires and might overall lead to an overall increase in carbon stocks. But there's also potential for sort of the flip side of that, where forests could be over harvested or maybe harvested primarily for bioenergy in a way that sort of either reduces the overall carbon stocks or leads to sort of a significant carbon debt, as we've heard about. Other SDGs on the negative side were SDG 15, which has some goals or targets around deforestation and biodiversity. So again, just making sure that the forest is managed in a way that doesn't negatively impact biodiversity, and that there's sort of a maximum residue removal rate identified for in different contexts and in different ecosystems, so that you're not negatively affecting either biodiversity or soil carbon or those other sort of important indicators in the forest. And so SDG 13 and 15 were sort of the top 2 negative impacts identified, or potential negative impacts, and it really was varied around some of the others. So there was some, point out that the technologies used really matter, because it can lead to negative impacts on air quality and indoor air quality if it's sort of the more traditional or sort of lower tech bioenergy solutions that are implemented. Concerns maybe around water quality, depending just how and where biomass is harvested. And yeah, I think those are sort of the main things that came up, and just really just sort of understanding the forest and making sure that biomass harvest or collection happens sort of within the confines of sustainable forest management for a particular ecosystem.
Great. Good. Thank you, Jean. So hard to summarize all of the conversation from an hour in 2 minutes on top of using the tool. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. And so let's hear from the other group. Andrew, I think you're going to speak on behalf of the other group that worked on forestry. So Andrew, maybe I'll turn things over to you.
Yeah, sure. Just let me share my screen.
Thank you.
Barb, can you see that?
It's just coming up now. Yep, it's good. And then you can just zoom in as you'd like to.
Sure. So ours is not quite as clear as I think some of our colleagues. There was a lot of discussion on a lot of different areas, but we'll start with the positive impacts at the top. So there was a lot of agreement here, and you'll notice that I have kind of tiered SDGs. While I was listening to my colleagues, I was kind of tiering them as we went along to hear who was in agreement on some of the top SDGs that we talked about, and then I have some more notes to help clarify this later. But so for number one, we were kind of torn between, I think, 13 and 15. There's a lot of agreement on how you can contribute to increasing biodiversity, increasing restoration of soils and nutrients to soils. You also notice that SDG 8 has kind of made its way through. That's because we had some really good conversation on the economic impacts, so not just the environmental impacts, but the economic opportunities that forest supply chains can offer local communities, as well as the transition to a low carbon economy. Number two here, we had some consensus around 11, 12 there, just like maximizing resource use efficiency, and 15 as well made it to kind of number two. So some alignment there, but specifically around 11 and 12, there's some good conversation around maximizing resources and cascading uses, and also starting to integrate these different materials into current supply chains and helping to decarbonize a lot of the supply chains around the world. And then number three was targeted, again, kind of at 11 and 8, those economic opportunities for countries and even local communities. And then for the negative part here, again, some more triaging has to happen here with the notes, but I think as Jean had just mentioned, number 15, there's a lot of agreement on the negative impacts if forest supply chains aren't implemented correctly. Clear cutting and deforestation, as long as removing important nutrients from the soils. Some interesting points here on our second prioritization. Some good aspects on the low carbon transition and equity, and ensuring that everyone is part of that equitable, inclusive transition. And if it's done improperly, you can have a lot of negative socioeconomic impacts. So someone had brought up increasing poverty, as well as SDG 8 again. So if they're not done equitably, you can continue to deepen poverty in a lot of areas of the world. And also for number 3 here, we came back to climate change, as well as kind of resource use efficiency. So again, if you're not properly implementing sustainable forestry management practices and those types of things, you can continue to increase the negative effects of climate change. Other SDGs to consider, not so much on the negative side, but the positive side. You can see that we've touched on number 6 here, number 14, so addressing water and water quality, and the ways we can use forest resources and forests themselves to improve water quality. Again, 11, there's a good point brought up by a colleague about number 4, about the importance of education, especially in other parts of the world. And also number 17, about the importance of partnerships and cooperation across regions and supply chains. So yeah, I think that's it.
Great, good, thanks, Andrew. You guys covered a lot of territory, a lot of layers to your discussion, and thank you for telling the story. Yes.
If you allow, there's one thing which I think was very important, that also SDG 16 was on the negative side, because there is some dispute around and disagreement around, if you look into the cultural context, that by this transition from the forestry with different ideas how you do forestry, you may actually have implications for the societal cohesion, conflicts between different groups and so forth. And I think that was an important thing. Sorry if I just brought this up, but I found it quite enlightening that we had this in the group. Thank you.
Interesting, great. Thanks for sharing that additional example. Good, okay, so we've heard from the 2 ag groups, the 2 forestry groups, and now I'd like to just turn things to Bruno. Your group talked about waste and other and multiple, so please share with us, Bruno, your reflections from your group. And would you like us to share the screen, or will you do so?
No, that would be helpful. If you
okay,
can,
great, good.
Pull
Chris,
the,
can you go ahead? Great, and we can zoom right in.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of SDGs that can be positively impacted, it would be similar to what others have provided or discussed initially. And if you move to the right of the screen, then we have our key messages as well. So I think decent work, economic growth is something that can be expected when you use waste or residuals for new purposes. So additional incomes, additional opportunities in terms of work. So this came out strongly. Climate action, SDG 13. If those waste would decay and either emit more GHG emissions or the same amount, if not used for bioenergy, then using them for bioenergy as a clear climate benefit. And as we were discussing waste biomass, I think SDG 12 on responsible consumption and production was something that was clearly top of mind, since we are making something out of feedstocks that weren't used, and then processing that feedstock into bioenergy can also result in co-products that themselves also can be useful, either in terms of nutrients or carbon sequestration in the soil. Maybe for the potential negative impacts, it was harder than for other types of biomass, because I think waste, it's easier to see the positives, and if you avoid something being emitted or released to the environment, then that's a strong positive impact as well. So negative impact were maybe less clear, but things came up under SDG 2, zero hunger. So if you divert this waste or residues from other uses, can have a negative impact on portions of the population. So another one is life on land. So if you take too much, or if you use a residue that was used before, and that served the ecosystemic purposes, then you can have impact on the land. And then clean water and sanitation as well. If waste or residues are processed in a way that releases pollutants to the environment, then there can be a clear impact as well on that side. And that's a summary from our group.
Great, thank you very much, Bruno. Really appreciate it. So I also just put a note in chat. There certainly seems to be some synergies as you listen to the different report facts from the various groups and their discussions. If you've got additional reflections or starting to connect some additional dots, feel free to put your thoughts into chat. And so folks, we are now going to just move into the last component for today's portion of the workshop, where we are really pleased to have a panel that is going to join us. We've got a few prepared questions and hopefully time for a couple questions from you as well. And to moderate today's discussion, I'd like to welcome Huva Fritz to the table. I imagine many of you know who Huva is, but for those of you who don't, he's the scientific director of the International Institute for Sustainability Analysis and Strategy since 2012. He also leads the IEA Bioenergy Task 40 and co-leads Task 45 with a focus on sustainability governance. He also contributes to the Global Bioenergy Partnership, leading that group's Sustainability Task Force Environment Subgroup. So with that, Huva, I'll turn it over to you and your panelists to have our conversation together.
Excellent, thanks, Barb. And thank you all for joining us this late in the afternoon or before lunch or in the late evening. You see that we have a nice question here, which tries to summarize some of our previous discussions with panelists, and I won't read all affiliations from Jesus, Florian, Hannes, Peter, Maria. That won't take too much time. All excellent people, and my role as a moderator will be to ask them questions, and later on, after a first round, or actually after 2 rounds between the panelists, we will expand to all of you, so you can raise questions already or statements in the chat, and Bruno will bring that into the panel discussion from the background, if I may say so. All right, let's start. We have pre-selected some questions for the colleagues, and once you answer, you can start with a very brief introduction of yourself, which you would like to share with the whole group, so that saves some time. The first question goes to Connie and to Florian, in that order. Can SDG implementation at the national level help the sustainable deployment of biomass supply chains for bioenergy? Connie, your view.
Hi, Uwe. You caught me a little bit by surprise. I thought that I had been substituted on the panel. I'm very happy to be speaking anyway. That you have caught me a little bit by surprise. So you were talking about SDG implementation at the national level and how it can help the sustainable deployment of biomass supply chains for bioenergy. So obviously, I think there's some really some connections here between the national level implementation of the SDGs and the requirements of the deployment of biomass supply chains, in the sense that the implementation of the SDGs obviously requires cross-sectional coordination between different ministries, different stakeholders. And this is a very similar approach that is required for the sustainable deployment of biomass supply chains. So I think from that point of view, when we're looking at SDG implementation, really the mindset, this shift to working in a cross-sectional manner and a holistic way is really supportive for this sustainable deployment. And we've seen it ourselves in GBEP when we've been implementing the GBEP sustainability indicators. Involving a multi-stakeholder group has really been key to share ideas, opinions, understand different points of view, and work together to cultivate holistic policies. Just also then, not only that, but focusing on the sustainable part of the deployment. Let's say that the SDGs also form this kind of a suitable framework for safeguarding of this deployment and ensuring that they're sustainable at the holistic level. So also from that point of view, they can be really positive. Thanks.
Thanks, Connie. I'm sorry for picking you up on the spot. Florian, same question to you, and you may introduce yourself. You haven't been introduced properly before, so take a minute to share with us your expertise.
Thank you, Uwe. Thank you for having me here on this panel. Florian Kraxner. I'm with the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria, in Luxembourg, Austria. So I'm heading there a group that looks into biophysical modeling in the agriculture, forestry area, land use, renewable energy. So actually at the center of the topics we are discussing here. And certainly, in order to answer also your question, besides presenting myself, I very much believe that implementation of SDGs at the national and even moreover at the local level will really help the supply chains to move into more sustainable thinking even and acting in the end. Because as we know, it's nice to have some policy ideas at national levels, even better to have them on a global agreement if we can reach that, of course, but the implementation has to be local. And we also know, for instance, from restoration activities that just come to my mind, that they are long proven before they make it through the canopy, so to say, and reach large-scale organizations, international organizations, transnational organizations. So I think implementation at local, regional, national level comes first, and this will be also the breakthrough for supply chains into the bioenergy sector.
Excellent. Thank you for this first round to the first question. I would like to go on with Peter Holgrim and also have a question for him, and he may also introduce Peter once you answer. Your question: to what extent is the SDG framework known and used within the field of bioenergy or in general resource management in your country? We all hear a lot about Sweden and its wonderful policies. So share it with us if you want.
Okay. Thanks, Uwe. I thought I would get the same question, so let me come back to this briefly. My name is Peter Holmgren. I worked for a number of years internationally. I was with FAO for 14 years, first at the Forestry Department, and then for the last 5 years as Director of Climate Change, Bioenergy and Land Tenure. And after that, I spent 5 years in Indonesia as the Director General of the Center for International Forestry Research, where we very much connected forestry to the SDGs. And then since 2018, we're back in Sweden, and I'm working as a consultant and advisor to the Swedish and European forest-based industry on sustainability issues and climate issues primarily. So thanks for inviting me to this panel. It's always great to reflect on many things that you hear in the discussion. Let me start by saying that I think it's great to have an SDG focus, because that means that we don't get stuck in the environmental dimension of, for example, bioenergy. We often do that, or rather we should not get stuck, but it doesn't always work, because if you take the Swedish national context that you asked about, the Agenda 2030 implementation is actually delegated to the Department or the Ministry of Environment, which I think is a mistake, because then again you get this bias towards the environment when it really needs to be all the 3 dimensions involved. So there's an issue there. Another issue is, of course, that we often hover in academic global thinking, also when we do this at the national level. And as already mentioned, I think by Florian, is that realities are very local and very varied, and it's impossible to make a proper assessment on priorities and weights between the different goals at the global level. And so the discussions sometimes become a little bit too generic. Global is really the sum of local, and that leads to the next question, which is valid also very much in the national discussion here. Who decides what's right? Who has the shall we say, delegated authority to put the weights on the SDGs that are considered the right ones in the local context? We have at the moment a very heated forestry debate in Sweden, and at the core of this is exactly this question. Should we rely on the individual forest owners, which are often family-based estates, very small, to decide what is best for their property in terms of all the sustainability issues? Or should we have a more centrally controlled system where the government decides what's protected and not? This is very much at the core of the discussion. You can also raise that to the EU level if you like, because we have the same issue between the national level and the EU level on these things. And at the moment we have several EU policies in pipeline that seems to try and govern things from the EU level rather than at the national level. So this is the scale of or resolution, the spatial resolution of decision making is really an issue.
Thanks, Peter.
I have
go ahead.
Yeah, I have one last point to make, and I think that's I think an often missing point, and I think you will appreciate this, Uwe, is SDG 16. And the reason I bring that up is that it's not just general governance issues that are contained here, but very much so the land tenure systems. And they are, of course, at the core of what we're trying to do here. And it's also connected to the question I raised before. who makes the decisions? How do we, or do we sit as central experts, or do we actually rely on people on the ground? So I'll stop there for now.
Thanks, Peter. That was an excellent addition. You brought up an issue which brings my kind of itinerary a bit, I'm going to change it because we are glad to have Hannes here who can build on what you raised, especially on the EU level discussion. And I think it would be nice, not from a governance point of view, that's an issue for tomorrow, basically, where we will surely discuss more about the governance, and I will be a participant and not just the moderator. So the question which I asked about the sustainability deployment of biomass within the context of an SDG implementation. We have heard from the JRC before that EU is quite active in implementing the SDGs in its policies. And Hannes, in your point of view, would you say this is a helpful activity? Can you comment also on what Peter just mentioned in the issue of who will decide? Ready to go? And introduce yourself briefly if you want to.
Okay, thank you, and have a nice day, all of you. I'm Hannes Tuohinit, and I'm here representing Bioenergy Europe as a president of Bioenergy Europe. I'm also a Finnish citizen working for the Finnish Bioenergy Association. Yes, it was an interesting presentation from JRC, and having a look at the SDG webpage they have produced. It's very interesting to see that it's a kind of overarching already in the EU policies, and in my mind it is there as Ms. Marelli already pointed out, that within the RED II directive, for instance, many SDGs are included there. For me, bioenergy is one of the few energy production forms that have really taken in the sustainability challenge, already starting early 2009 when the first RES directive was introduced, and now it's being extended to all kind of bioenergy. And in my understanding, there are no clear legal framework for any other energy form in EU at the moment regarding sustainability. Sure, there are discussions on their taxonomy coming up, but not other renewable energies, let alone fossil fuels, are somehow covering the issue of sustainability. And I tend to agree with Mr. Holmgren about the problem that who is really deciding on what is sustainable and what is the let's say what is the level of interlinkage between different SDGs, because it's quite evident that they can never be all of the SDGs equal. For instance, regarding biomass and biomass supply chain, there are some SDGs that are more prominent, and bioenergy and biomass can also contribute to the SDGs and contribute to the sustainability on many levels. For instance, there are win-win pathways for biomass chain that are contributing to biodiversity. This is something that is not clearly evident for everyone. For instance, let's say looking at the biogas raw material, if the farmer is using the land to produce grasses or legumes, perennial plants instead of very monoculture cereal production to produce raw material for biogas. It's benefiting the biodiversity, just as an example. But this is maybe the key points to answer your question, Uwe.
Thank you, Hannes. It won't be the last time I'm going to ask you something. We have two more panelists I would like to invite to answer the question and briefly introduce themselves in doing so. Maria Bellish and Jesus Esperanza. And my question for you, both of you, the same question, maybe Maria can start, would be as follows. Do you think that better demonstrating the contribution of biomass to the SDGs is a critical component or element in the acceptability of bioenergy and other bio-based products, especially in the social domain, but not exclusively? So will that help us in the debate which goes on around the planet? Maria, you got the floor. You unmute yourself, please. Maria?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry about that. Thank you for the introduction. So I'm with Agriculture, the Federal Ministry of Agriculture in Canada. And my comments really come from maybe more focused work recently on trying to grow the adoption of anaerobic digestion in agriculture. And clearly here, being able to communicate what those SDGs are, the multiple benefits, the multifunctionality of AD is very helpful. Just to provide a tiny bit of background, we only have a small number. We have 46 digesters operating, so not hundreds, not thousands. And they came about because of renewable energy policy in certain provinces. So they wanted to increase their capacity of renewable electricity. And that was about 10, 15 years ago. And since that time, so we saw a small number of facilities develop. And now we no longer have the FIT contracts because we have other renewable sources that are less expensive than that. We certainly, now we see the shift to climate change and greenhouse gas mitigation as being an important driver, let's say the last 3 to 5 years. And here, this is driving really that adoption for GHG purposes. So looking at introducing, upgrading biogas, cleaning it up, going into the natural gas distribution system as green gas or biomethane. And here too, we see a limited number of applications. Again, AD is expensive. It's more expensive than other forms of going municipal waste, for example, to biogas to RNG, to biomethane is less expensive. There are also less expensive greenhouse gas reduction measures that it has to compete with. So we're sort of moving along the SDGs to the next SDG set for us, which is really sustainable agriculture and nutrient cycling. So 12, for example, SDG 12. So it's providing more doors for this, I guess, waste to energy nutrient technology to be implemented. And so it's, I think, very important to talk about all the SDGs. Maybe just to close to say, I think it's great to have this framework at the national level, but as the other speakers have said, it's really needs to be done at, especially in the a country size of Canada, needs to be done at a regional level. So what are the regionally relevant SDGs? And for that community to decide, what makes sense for us. If we're already hydro-based, the clean energy or clean electricity SDG is not nearly as relevant as if you're in a coal-fired, electricity province. So those kind of obvious things. And maybe the last point being that although I'm a big fan of, the three pillars and sustainable development in its broadest sense, it is much more complex for decision makers and to communicate. So having the SDGs is a great framework. I think a really important one for us to have nationally. We need to be applying it, regionally, what's regionally relevant, and then we need tools to make decisions in terms of multi-criteria decision making. How do we engage stakeholders? How do we prioritize actions? I think that's really critical to really making it more than just a goal setting checklist exercise to implementing action.
Thanks, Maria, for these excellent points. Jesus, you get the floor for the same question, and happy to hear about you as a person first.
Thank you, Uwe. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Jesus Esparza. I work for Solidaridad Network. Solidaridad is a civil and social organization that is based in the Netherlands with presence in more than 40 countries in the global south. And well, we worked since 50 years ago, actually, the organization was founded. We worked in the beginning with farmers that were located in Central America, producing coffee and cocoa. Then later, we created something that now is worldwide known as the Fair Trade Certificate. We also have been involved in the creation of also other certifications like the Roundtable Sustainable Palm Oil and also Bon Sucro. So, well, our outreach is quite huge in the agricultural world. And our number one priority is to benefit farmers, to pay the fair share and to improve their livelihoods. Well, with all that being said, my job there is to create new business model for farmers when it comes to the use and the uptake of bio-waste materials. Everything that is produced on their farmlands perhaps could be used for higher value applications. So, well, whatever might be available on any given landscape. Well, with all that said, sorry, in addressing the question on how can the SDGs could demonstrate, the improvements in the livelihoods maybe, and even local communities, and the contributions that biomass actually, gives to the SDGs, I would say that, well, the SDGs seem to be like a very good framework in which everybody could speak the very same language and refer to the very same KPIs, for instance. Now we see a growing number of PPPs, public and partnerships that are created around the SDGs. So, well, when it comes to biomass, and the global south, different SDGs that people perhaps will not assimilate or link directly, like, to give you an example, gender equality, I think that is SDG number 5. People will say, well, what does it have to be? What is the relationship, rather, with the biomass? Well, it turns out that in sub-Saharan countries, for instance, a woman in average spends walks 20 kilometers to just outsource wood for cooking. So, by providing them, providing these women a clean source of energy for cooking, we might free up a lot of time for them so they can work in different economic activities that can improve the livelihoods of the whole family. So, well, I can continue giving, other examples of, poverty alleviation. Yes, in the global south, biomass perhaps is the only source that countries like Zambia or Malawi have to just produce energy and grow pretty much. So it is a keystone there, and the SDGs are actually a very good reference to tell the stories of the development and also to say, what is missing. Because, well, for the North, perhaps, the SDGs can refer to development, to energy, to the climate, but for the South, we're speaking about food, nutrients, all these elements that are pretty much needed, and that should be preserved and kept in a balance, let's say. So, with all that, perhaps I would like to finish my answer, but that's how the SDGs would represent the development or the achievement, of these development goals.
Thanks for that, and especially opening up a little bit even more to the southern part of the world, if I may say so, coming from the north. Before opening up the panel to further questions and inputs from the participants, let me raise one point, and not all of you have to respond, but I would like to ask especially Florian and Hannes that point. When we have a regional integration, we heard about local context, no doubt about it, and translation. That's where people live. That's where the land is used. That's where residues are produced and possibly used. Okay, but what about, isn't there something like a joint level? Would you agree that we need a regional, international kind of view on that? Because we also have trade, right? So in that sense, question to Florian and to Hannes, what about going beyond the national level? Is that something where the SDGs can also help us? We have a discussion about localization and there is national implementation, okay. But just for the moment, would we also have to consider international activities? Maybe Florian first.
Well, thank you, Uwe. Very interesting continuation of this question. Actually, now I have to revise my answer a little bit. Yes, implementation happens and starts locally, but we need also, let's say, look beyond the borders with respect to the framing in which we move in order to also keep our efforts comparable to each other. So it doesn't help if we have a very colorful mosaic without some basic rules, be it in the accounting, for instance, talking about greenhouse gas emissions, for instance, or be it in potential assessments, both very relevant for the bioenergy topic. So I believe that we should move and also proactively influence such more global conventions or agreements on methodologies in order to really show the effectiveness of what we are doing. And here, particularly in a technical aspect, for instance, we should agree on certain things like you can, even though drones, for instance, for measuring potentials are getting more and more attractive and cheaper, etc. You can still not do it without the ground truthing, with the help of the people who live there. And you need two things in order to come up with a decent assessment of carbon storage, for instance, which will be in the future one important item once it comes to this multiple production of forest, for instance, for bioenergy, for carbon sequestration, etc. So we need a framework, a technical framework that is international and all along also influences, of course, the supply chains, because everything needs to be monitored. And here in this kind of methodology, we really need to go for international conventions in order to be comparable. This is my ad hoc opinion here.
Thanks. Hannes, your view from a European regional thing, and clearly I would also allow Connie to say something on that question if she wants. Hannes, you got the floor.
Yes, it's an interesting question, and I'm sorry, but my answer is not short one. I'm starting with pointing out that there are natural differences in different parts of the world, which has to reflect how you look into the SDGs. And also, SDGs are like umbrella for more detailed criteria, and I think that discussion about SDGs on international level is quite relevant and needed, but it's very important not to build up a system which is on top, or which would be kind of contradictory with the already existing framework, like framework within RED II directive on sustainability criteria. And also it's already evident that this discussion on taxonomy, whether you like it or not, it's already on the international agenda. And actually I would invite all the scientists that are really into bioeconomy and biomass to participate on that discussion, because the problem in our view is that taxonomy is now being drafted or written by non-experts on biomass issues and national bioresource issues, but more or less people that are more into finance and economy, and that's important to join that discussion to get it right. That's maybe my main view on this issue.
Thanks. Thank you, Hannes. Before I ask Connie if she wants to add, just one hint. IEA Bioenergy is currently discussing its working program for the next 3 years, and sustainable finance is one of the major issues there. So a critical reflection and inputs to the debate about the European taxonomy is clearly coming up, and we see in Asia respective developments, which I personally deem quite interesting. Connie, you want to add before we open up? If you want to, you don't have to.
No, I mean, I agree with all that has been said before, really, by Florian and Hans. I mean, obviously, the monitoring of the achievement of the goals is at a global level, but also local autonomy in terms of deciding which of those goals is going to be the most important in the local context is important, given that there will be the trade-offs between the goals and the targets. And I think it also brings something that Jesus mentioned before in terms of thinking about equality as well. It's an important component. What are the priorities of the local stakeholders? How do we ensure that the right people are benefiting, let's say? And I think from that point of view, looking at a lower level and trying to also include participation and meaningful participation of those people is extremely important. Thanks.
Thank you. Jesus, you just want to follow up on that?
Yeah, perhaps just to second that exactly. I think that well, there is going to be always this, paradoxes everywhere, in which either we want to push for one SDG and then, harm the development of the other, for instance. But the answer to this is, again, to look at every single problem through a landscape approach, to see what is the need locally, what is the cycle, for instance, the natural cycle of resources looking like, what the voices also of indigenous peoples is something that is important. It should be encouraged to hear, and to bring to the table. So all these components will give the answer, the final answer of what SDGs should be given priority or not, instead of, policymakers that are economists sitting in Brussels, directing what is the #1 priority that should be applied in the global south. So yeah, it starts the other way around, actually. Going there, whatever. And somebody even asked on the chat, what is a landscape approach? Well, a landscape approach, for instance, could be, yes, at a national level. If we speak of I don't know, a country like Indonesia, but we could zoom into a province like Kampur, and see what is going on there with palm oil and the waste, and how the bioeconomy could be implemented there and deliver some of the SDGs.
Thanks. Peter, you have your hand up. Short input from your side. Unmute your mic, please.
Yeah, so yes, thanks. Obviously, there is an international layer here where you need to set the framework, you need to have some ideas of how to compare things. But the problem comes when you try to decide things in detail at that very high level, and that's the same as several others have been speaking about. In this regard, the Paris Agreement did it right, in my view. They set an overall target, but they left it up to the individual countries to figure out how they would contribute to this. We have other examples. The CBD is trying to set out a target of 30% protected areas. Well, that might be fine if you don't go too far in specifying that, but if you specify it in a strict way, then you will cause a lot of political problems and probably not achieve what you want. The taxonomy is another example of this. They are going way too far into details. They could have left it at a much higher level and then left it to implementation to figure out what the best way forward would be. So yes, we have a major problem with too many experts, including probably many of ourselves, getting too much involved in too many details.
Thanks, Peter. I know time is running short, but I won't miss the opportunity to hear Jim Philp. He wants to raise a question and make a statement. Jim, you got the floor.
Thank you, Uwe. And it's a question which has perplexed me for a while about the expansion and the use of biomass. And I've got two very short quotations I want to give you here, and they won't take long. The first one is that between 15 and 30% of wood traded globally is obtained illegally, rising to 50 to 90% in key tropical countries. And the second quotation is from the FAO, who say illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing is one of the greatest threats to sustainability of global fishery resources. Now, for me, I think the question I want to ask here is, when you start to implement and govern, if you like, the SDGs, that's all very well with the good guys, but don't you create more opportunities for the bad guys and therefore make this illegal thing more of a problem?
Well, that's a tough cookie for, I think, for all of us. Legality has also been, or illegality, in the chat already. So I think that's clearly something we have to consider, and hopefully we'll discuss a little bit deeper also tomorrow. Oh, I see Peter has raised his hands, and I would also like to hear Jesus on that. So please, go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, no, our question back is, of course, who decides who is the bad guy and who is the good guy? We have an interesting example of the EU trade barrage against palm oil at the moment. Well, that may be correct that the EU has its opinion about the sustainability of palm oil, but I'm sure that the Malaysian and Indonesian governments have a completely different view on what's good and what's bad.
All right, please.
Yeah, exactly. So here we touch upon, what is the governance and what are the frameworks that are putting, these tags, or what is good, what is bad, what is not sustainable, what is irresponsible, and in fact, following that case of palm oil. Well, palm oil, yes, has lots of environmental problems. Yes, there is deforestation, child labor, lots of very pressing problems, but it is, the source of income of 3 million people. And we cannot just say with just like saying, well, generalistic view, oh, everything is bad, what is going to happen to the income of all those people? The same happens with illegal deforestation and all that. So therefore, we have these other schemes that now are moving towards, certification on saying, well, this was outsourced more responsibly. No, I'm not saying, perhaps in the best way, but at least it's not the worst. And, the consumers are moving towards that action as well, to push for the consumption and the production, first and foremost, of more sustainable products. And certifications are proving to be a good way to guarantee that. Not to, unfortunately, they cannot solve everything, but they are doing an improvement, and the certifications also are being framed, around SDGs too. So it's a very interesting point here to discuss, indeed.
Surely the discussion won't end here, even if time gets to an end for the allocated time. Jorge Hilbert, you had a point in the chat, which I would like you to take a look at. It's not the time now to bring this up, but it was excellent issue to say, aren't we captured too narrow in the bioenergy debate and some feedstock discussions instead of looking to the broader issues such as food and landscapes and so forth. So there are nice issues in the chat. I hope you have the opportunity to reflect on that during your evenings, nights, afternoons. For now, I would say excellent contributions to all, making us aware that the SDGs seems to be a good umbrella, a good talking point, a good language. I like that. But clearly translation, implementation is something we won't do on the international level. On the other hand, we need some guidelines. I guess that's what we can take, and we'll discuss more tomorrow in the light of more examples we're gonna see. So I'd like to bet your mouse. And Bruno, is there something I have missed in the chat which needs to be reflected in this panel?
Thank you, Uwe. I think if people are comfortable sticking around for a few more minutes, we can leave the floor to Jorge to maybe ask his question around like what should supply chains, like what the scope should be. Should we look beyond like only bioenergy, and hear what people have to think like for the next couple minutes before we wrap up with closing remarks.
Okay, that gives us some leeway. So Hannes, maybe for you to reflect on Jorge's issue, bioenergy, or the broader point, the debate we have in Europe with the RED II, now all bioenergy, is it good enough, or do we need to go further and have the bioeconomy? Just short answer to that one.
Well, that's a tricky question, I must say, because within the framework of RED II or RED directive, it's not possible to extend the scope maybe too much into other use of biomass, but it's also like stepping into the competence discussion, which is quite let's say hectic at the moment in Nordic countries. I maybe decline to answer on this question further.
Okay, I fully understand Maria coming from Canada, where we are not restricted to EU logics. Would you have a view on that?
So you're looking at extending the discussion beyond bioenergy to the more full bioeconomy? Well, I would say it kind of necessarily happens because we always produce those co-products, you know, and like if we look at biofuel production, you know, a co-product could be animal feed, and then we're looking at displacing something else, or we're looking at glycerol going into another, or what to do with DDGS or other. So we enter into that space, I think, naturally, because things aren't, maybe not so much for combustion of biomass, but for the other, if in the biofuel space, it's very hard to separate it out. Like for us in agriculture, very hard to separate it out from animal feed. You know, there's a loop back. We produce energy, but we produce either nutrients for the soil, or we produce a co-product, which is animal feed, which displaces another crop. So it's already there, I think. And we can, again, create a silo to make it more manageable and tackle the problem perhaps more easily, but it is all interrelated, right?
Good point. Before I pass over to Connie, we have Jorge here. Mr. Hilbert, great colleague, also very active in the GBEP. Maybe you share your views directly in an oral issue of your presentation. The floor is yours. If you unmute yourself.
Okay, yes. Oh, thank you. It's very nice to hear you again. Yes, I've been putting some aspects, two main aspects. So one One is the overall view of this biomass transformation change. We see in our experience analyzing these types of transformation, the biorefineries keep on adding and adding more and more products every year. So the overall environmental impact on each of these products is lowering down. And one of the products is biofuels of them. So we need to have another perspective. And another point I wanted to address is this disruptive world we are living on. No, we tend to reproduce what we know on the past years to the future, and the world that's coming is completely different. No, so this artificial meats, this will change the whole agriculture in the whole world, and we need to take a look and make more crazy scenarios for the near future. Thank you for your kind opportunity.
Pleasure. And the scenarios discussion is clearly something I really like. Connie, you got the floor.
Thanks very much. Now, I can't speak to the disruptive change. I mean, it's an interesting thing, but it's also difficult to predict. No, but just talking a little bit about this kind of looking at the broader environment, looking at broader biomass instead of just bioenergy. I mean, with GBEP, especially looking at the monitoring of the sustainability of bioenergy, it's always a big issue. Looking at allocating the impacts of bioenergy, the impacts just to bioenergy instead of the broader bioeconomy or whichever area or sector we're looking at. And so it's really also because the data is missing. No, in a lot of cases, it's difficult to narrow it down just to bioenergy, but also trying to figure out what is the driver of that impact, because that also makes a difference. I mean, we're interested in the outcomes, we're interested in the impacts, but we're also interested in looking at why is that impact happening? What is the driver? Is it bioenergy, or is it the production of biomass for something else? And so I think looking at bioenergy in the context of the broader bioeconomy is really useful for that. Thanks.
Thank you. Great wording. I like that. Well, Bruno, what about our time? Do you give us another 5 minutes that we turn around, or do you want to say we're done for today and start getting your closing remarks? Give me some indication, please.
Yeah, so I think we are ready to make closing remarks. I know people have busy schedules. Some are looking forward to lunch or dinner. So yeah, we will turn it over to Biana for closing remarks.
Thanks.
And let me thank, before you do so, Biljana, I take the liberty to thank all the participants in the panel and the active ones from the audience. And I'm absolutely sure we have more to discuss, not only tomorrow, but in the years to come, if I may say. So it's a long story. And 2030 is next door. It's a decade for action. That's what we know. But as a scientist, I like also to have new questions. So surely the story will continue. Now, again, thank you. And Biljana, you got the floor.
Well, Uwe, you stole my line. So I wanted to thank to the panelists, but not only to this panel, but the overall workshop of the day one, to the moderators, to the participants. Honestly, there were so excellent discussions going on in different sessions and in different panels that definitely it was really, the time just passed by. But today we talked about relationships between biomass supply chains and the SDGs, and tomorrow we will not stop. We will continue to talk about best practices and governance to enhance the co-benefits and the contributions to the SDGs. What is important to tell you is that we have in the background, we have tried very hard to record and to capture all these thoughts and exchange of perspectives and controversies and benefits and views. And we would record all that in the report. And we will send you before publishing the final version, we will send it over to the participants to see the draft, the final draft, to see whether you want to comment or add something to it. And then it will be a joint material
presented as an IA Bioenergy Workshop material report. And for that, you will have these presentations available soon, and the report will come in early fall. So let's hope to see you same time, same place tomorrow. And that was all. Thank you for participation.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Biana, and see you tomorrow.
Thank you. 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 See you.
Bye-bye.
Well, I can say as an observer that it was great. On time, professional, good, excellent experience. Really, the time passed like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Biana. It was great to have your leadership throughout. And really great to have all the participants, I guess, all the workshop leaders too, to help make those conversations in the groups go through, because it was a bit of a tough technical challenge. So they did really well.
We will be better tomorrow. So
everyone knows it.
Yeah, yes. So thank you. I will go to my boys.
Yes, enjoy your
Yes.
evening. Bye,
Yes.
Biana. See you tomorrow.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.
It's just us. Bruno and Andrew left.
Can we stop the recording?